Stillwater, the novel, written and narrated by Osprey Dixon. Stillwater, written and narrated by Osprey Dixon. Chapter 1. The Window. Stillwater, Saskatchewan, December 1982. The cold had a sound to it that morning. Not the howl you hear in city alleys or the moan through half-sealed windows, but something quieter, a kind of steady hum, as if the land itself was shivering. Clara May Benton woke to it before dawn, her breath clouding faintly in the air. The old farmhouse creaked like an animal settling its bones. Somewhere below, the iron belly of the furnace kicked in with a sigh, but the corners of her room still held frost, silvering the edges of her school photos and the frame of her mirror. She lay still, cocooned in quilts her mother had pieced from old flannel shirts, listening to the slow tick of the clock on the dresser. Every sound felt louder in winter, the boards expanding, her own lungs working, the whisper of her hair against the pillowcase. Through the frost-patterned window above her bed, the world was the color of pewter. Snow drifted over the fields, soft and endless, blurring the fence line and the outline of the barn. The pond lay somewhere beyond that. The dugout her father had carved years ago for watering cattle. Now it slept under a crust of white and ice, the surface rippled and wind-scarred. Clara pressed her hand to the window pane. The cold bit instantly. Her palm left a ghost print that fogged, then vanished. Downstairs, her mother was already awake. Clara could hear her in the kitchen, the soft scrape of a spoon against a pot. Chicken broth again, probably. Everything these days smelled faintly of sage and vapor rub. The stairs groaned as Ruth Benton came up, carrying the chipped blue bowl. "You're awake," she said softly, smiling with that worn gentleness mothers get when they've been tired for too long. "It's still early. Try to eat a bit before it gets cold." Clara sat up slowly, her lungs protesting the movement. "It's freezing." "It's December," her mother said, setting the bowl on the nightstand. "And your father's already outside. Heaven help him." Through the window, Clara could just make out the glow of the barn light, yellow against the gray morning. A moment later came the sound she loved the most, the cough and rumble of the old tractor turning over, a deep, throaty growl that cut through the stillness. "He said he was checking the fence?" Ruth muttered, pulling the quilt tighter around Clara's shoulders. "More likely he just can't sit still." Clara smiled faintly. "He hates being inside." "So do you," Ruth said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "You're the same that way." She tried to eat, the broth rich and salty, but her throat still felt like paper. The fever had broken days ago, yet weakness lingered, a strange floating weariness that kept her confined to the upstairs room. She missed everything: the sound of skates scraping ice, the way the air smelled when it snowed, even the taste of tin from the old thermos her father filled with cocoa. Outside, the tractor's engine deepened into a steady rhythm. Clara shifted closer to the window, peering through the narrow, clear patch she'd rubbed into the frost. She could see him now, Elias Benton, tall and broad-shouldered under his wool coat, hat pulled low. He moved slowly through the yard, the tractor tires crunching over frozen snow. Steam rose from the exhaust like a living thing. He paused once, wiping his gloved hand across the windshield. Then, almost as if sensing her watching, he looked up toward the house. Their eyes met across the white expanse. Clara lifted her fingers to the glass in a small wave. He raised his hand back, and for a second the cold didn't matter at all. She watched until he disappeared behind the stand of birch near the pond. Then only the echo of the engine remained, fading, swallowed by the wind. The light changed by degrees, from iron gray to the faintest gold as the sun began its slow climb behind the horizon. Frost crystals on the glass caught the light and scattered it, small galaxies across her wall. Her mother was humming now, some hymn from church. O come, Emmanuel," the kind that sounded like prayer, even without the words. Clara closed her eyes. She thought about the pond, the smell of skates sharp as pennies, the laughter that used to ring across from frozen air. She imagined herself there again, scarf whipping, cheeks stinging with cold, her father's voice calling from the shore. But when she opened her eyes, all she saw was the still white field and the faint plume of tractor exhaust trailing into the distance. The house sighed. The day began. The light was already leaving the sky when Alliance Benton shut off the tractor. The engine coughed once, twice, and then settled into a ticking silence. Steam drifted from the muffler, curling upward before vanishing into the dusk. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, the hum of vibration fading into the ache in his knuckles. The pond lay ahead of him, white and rippled, a patch of hard earth in a frozen world. He'd plow snow all afternoon from the lane and the fence lane, but his eyes kept straying toward that stretch of ice, remembering how it used to look in other winters. The girls from town in their wool scarves, Clara's red mittens flashing as she skated in circles, the sound of her laughter sharp as sleigh bells. He missed that sound, like a missing piece of bone. Now the pond just lay still. The wind had pressed drifts against the far shore, and the ice carried a faint blue sheen under the dying light. Elias climbed down, boots crunching on the packed snow. He walked closer until he could see his reflection ghosting faintly on the surface. The air was brittle with cold. Even his breath came out in shatters. "Come spring," he muttered, rubbing at his jaw, "we'll have to dig out the south end again." But he wasn't thinking about spring. He stooped, brushing a gloved hand over the surface. A thin film of snow lifted away, revealing ice, thick, clouded, solid-looking. Still, he felt that unease in his gut. It had been mild last week, and the spring fed through underneath. You could never quite trust a still water pond. He straightened and looked toward the house. Through the window, the lamplight had come on, warm gold against the gray. A small shape moved there, barely visible past the frost. Clara. He raised a hand, the gesture instinctive, though she couldn't see him from that distance. Then he turned toward the barn, the smell of diesel and hay clinging to his coat. Inside, the house was thick with the scent of stew and wood smoke. The kerosene lamp on the table flickered, throwing soft light across the walls, lined with family photos, baptisms, harvests, weddings long past. Ruth moved quietly between stove and sink, her apron dusted with flour, humming underneath her breath. Clara sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in her blanket, a cup of tea steaming before her. She'd begged to come downstairs for supper, and Ruth had relented, though every cough made her flinch. Elias stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door. "Cold enough to bite," he said, trying for cheer. "You'd think the sky forgot how to stop snowing." Ruth turned with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sit. You're letting in a draft." He crossed the room, pausing behind Clara's chair. "You got your appetite back yet?" She nodded, spoon already in hand. "A little. Mom says I'm pale." "You're winter pale, that's all." He reached out, brushing her hair gently away from her face. Her skin was cool under his callous fingers. "When the sun comes back, we'll get color on those cheeks again." Ruth ladled stew into bowls and set them down. The three of them ate mostly in silence, the clink of spoons against enamel the only sound. Outside, the wind rose and fell like someone breathing against the walls. After a while, Clara spoke. "I saw you on the tractor, from my window." He smiled. "You did, huh?" "You waved." "I did." She hesitated. "Was it frozen enough to skate on?" Ruth shot him a look, that silent mother's warning not to promise too much. But Clara's voice was so small, so full of something that might have been hope, that Elias couldn't bring himself to temper it. "Not yet," he said gently. "Needs a few more nights like this, but it's close. Can we have a party when it's ready?" Her eyes brightened. "Like last year? Cocoa and music on the radio?" Elias swallowed. He could almost see it. The lanterns strung between fence posts, the kids from town laughing, Ruth bringing out tin cups. For a heartbeat, it was right there. The old world where everything still worked and nothing had fallen through. He reached across the table, covering Clara's small hand with his own. "We will, sweetheart," he said softly. "We'll have the best rink in the country." Ruth looked down at her bowl, pretending to focus on her stew. The lamp hissed faintly. Outside, snow had begun again, slow, steady, endless. The windows glazed over, the frost returning to claim its patterns. Somewhere in the dark, the pond lay waiting, silent as a prayer. Chapter 2. The Pond. The next morning, the cold came back meaner. It had that metallic edge that bit the inside of your nose and made the boards on the porch crack. The snow that had fallen overnight was fine and dry, sifting like sugar over the drifts. Elias Benton drove the truck into town with the heater whining and the radio coughing out static. The roads were more memory than pavement, 2 narrow tracks carved between walls of snow. Every so often, he'd pass a mailbox buried to its flag or a line of frozen cattails bending in the wind. Stillwater in winter didn't so much as live as endure. The co-op sat square at the crossroads, a squat building with one flickering fluorescent light above the door and a hand-painted sign that had once been red. The grain elevator loomed behind it like a frozen monument. Across the street, the post office and cafe huddled close, their windows filmed with frost and wood smoke. He parked by the co-op, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. A few men were already inside. You could tell by the glow of the orange hats through the window and the faint rhythm of laughter that came with the doors opening. Inside smelled of feed, oil, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn. Boots scraped, voices carried. It was the kind of warmth that came less from heat and more from habit. People keeping each other from freezing by way of conversation. "Morning, Eli," said Carl Hallberg, nodding from behind the counter as he measured out a sack of feed. His breath puffed in the cold air. "Roads treat you all right?" "Good enough," Elias said, stomping snow from his boots. "Could use another pass with the plow, but I managed." "Winter's just getting started," Hallberg chuckled. "You'll be cussing it by New Year's." A few of the old farmers near the stove laughed. Donnie Frey, whose hearing aid whistled when he smiled, lifted his cup in greeting. "Heard you've got the pond freezing over nice this year." Elias nodded. "Looks solid from the top." "That's the trick word. From the top," Donnie said, grinning. "You remember 2 winters ago? Fred Mason drove his truck out there to haul a deer and near went swimming." "Fred's luck's worse than his judgment," someone else muttered. Hallberg leaned on the counter, lowering his voice just enough for the talk to turn serious. "You got that spring that feeds through, don't you, Eli? From the north pasture?" Eli shrugged. "Way I figure, it's sealed solid by now. We've had near 2 weeks below zero." "Maybe," Hallberg said. But there was something like caution in his tone. "That current under the south end don't care what the thermometer says." Elias didn't reply. He'd grown up hearing that same warning, how the pond wasn't a true pond at all, just a wide-mouthed watering hole fed by an underground trickle. Some winters it froze hard enough to hold a tractor. Others, it just pretended to. He'd driven across it before, plenty of times. "I'll take a new shear pin and a gallon of kerosene," he said, finally changing the subject. "And if you got chains for the rear tires, I might as well be ready for the next storm." Hallberg turned to fill the order. The men went back to their talk. Hunting, hockey, the endless question of whether the grain elevator would ever reopen. Elias waited, staring at the frost webbing across the window. A truck went by outside, snow spinning in its wake. He thought about Clara. the way her eyes had brightened last night when she mentioned skating. He hadn't seen that spark in months. The sickness had taken more than her appetite. It had stolen her laughter. And what was a father supposed to do when his child stopped laughing? He signed the receipt, loaded the supplies in his truck, and stood for a moment under the weak daylight. Across the street, Mrs. Lasky was sweeping snow from the steps of the cafe, her hair tied in a kerchief. She gave him a wave and he returned it automatically. "Tell Ruth to bring Clara in when she's better," she called. "I'll make her a hot chocolate on the house." He smiled, grateful and embarrassed at once. "Will do." Then he turned his collar up against the wind and climbed in his truck. The road home wound past bare poplars and a frozen creek that glittered in the paled sun. The world looked harmless, white, quiet, still. But Elias knew how deceptive that stillness could be. Ice made promises it didn't always keep. When he turned down his lane, the farmhouse came into view, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray column. Clara's curtain was open. He could almost see the outline of her small face at the window. He tapped the horn twice, a soft habit from years back, their little signal. She waved, or maybe he just imagined it, but it was enough. He parked beside the barn and climbed out, the cold biting through his gloves. The pond was visible beyond the windbreak, smooth and waiting, reflecting the sun like dull glass. He watched it for a long moment, the idea forming clear as breath. If she wanted to skate again, he'd make it happen. He'd clear it by hand if he had to. The morning came in soft and colorless, a pale wash of light seeping through the kitchen curtains. The wind had eased, leaving the world muffled, as though the whole town were sleeping under one great wool blanket. Ruth Benton stood at the sink, her hands lost in a basin of warm water, watching her husband through the window. He was by the barn, working over the tractor. The sound of metal on metal rang sharp in the still air, carrying clear to the house. He'd been up since before dawn. She'd woken to the smell of coffee and the squeal of the back door hinges, the sound of a man who couldn't bear to sit still another minute. Now she watched him check the plow attachment, hands steady, movements sure. He'd always been patient with machines, never rushed them, never cursed when they broke, just fixed what he could, made do with what he had. But this morning, there was something urgent in him. She dried her hands and stepped to the porch, pulling her cardigan tight against the cold. "You're not thinking of taking that down by the pond," she called. Elias didn't look up right away. He crouched, tightening the bolts on the plow blade, the wrench slipping once before he caught it. Finally, he straightened and faced her. "Just want to clear some of the snow, see how thick the ice is." "You can see that from the edge." He smiled, faint but stubborn. "Not the way I need to." "Eli," her voice softened. "That current's still running under there. You know it." "I know," he said, "but the top's solid. We've had 2 weeks of hard freeze. I'll stay near the shore." She shook her head, her breath showing in the cold. "You promised me after Mason's truck went through, no machines on the dugout again." He came closer, wiping his hands on a rag. "This isn't the same. I'm not going that far out. He stopped, glancing toward the upstairs window, where he knew Clara would be watching. "She's getting better, Ruth. You see it too. That spark's coming back." Her eyes softened, but worry didn't leave them. "And if you fall through, what then? What happens to us?" He reached for her hand, his glove rough against her skin. "You've seen worse winters with me. That's not an answer." "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." They stood there for a moment, the kind of silence that fills old marriages, layered with all the things already said too many times. Finally, Ruth sighed and stepped back toward the door. "Just stay near the edges," she said. "Please?" "I will." He meant it when he said it. By noon, the world had brightened. The sky stretched wide and clean, kind of prairie blue that only shows itself after a storm. The sunlight bounced off the snow so hard it made your eyes ache. Clara stood bundled on the porch, her mother's wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck, mittens stiff with age. Her breath puffed like smoke as she watched her father back the tractor toward the yard. The sight of him made her chest tighten. That familiar shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head under his cap. Everything in her life felt smaller now, slower, like she was seeing through glass. But the world outside was big again, and she wanted to touch it. Ruth followed her out, standing beside her on the steps. "Don't stay out long, you'll tire quick." "I won't," Clara said, though her legs already trembled a little. She stepped down into the snow, her boots sinking deep. The air bit at her lungs, sharp but clean, and for a second, she thought she might cry from how good it felt just to breathe outside air again. Elias waved from the seat of the tractor, one hand on the wheel, the other lifting and greeting. The plow blade shone where he'd sharpened it, sunlight catching along its edge. The engine rumbled like a living thing. Clara raised her hand back. He started moving, slow, steady passes through the yard, carving away the drifted snow. Each turn brought him a little closer to the pond. The dog, Rex, followed along the fence, barking at the noise, tail-cutting arcs in the snow. Ruth stood with her arms crossed, watching, her face unreadable. "He never could leave well enough alone," she muttered. Clara frowned up at her. "He's just fixing the yard." Ruth said softly. "That's what he always says." The tractor's path widened. Elias circled the edge of the pond, the plow pushing snow in crisp curls off to the side. The ice gleamed beneath, smooth, clouded, beautiful. From where Clara stood, it looked perfect, the way she remembered it from winters past. Her heart lifted. Maybe it really was strong enough. Maybe soon she'd skate again, her scarf flying behind her, her father's laughter echoing off the trees. Ruth put a hand on her shoulder. "Time to come in, sweetheart." "Just a minute," Clara whispered. They watched as Elias parked the tractor near the willows, climbed down, and walked to the edge of the ice. He tested it with his boot. It held. Ruth's hand tightened on Clara's shoulder. Elias turned and looked toward the house. From that distance, they couldn't see his face, but his hand lifted once more. A small wave that meant everything and nothing, all at once. Clara waved back, both mittens. The sun began to dip then, casting long shadows across the snow. The tracks of the tractor led from the barn straight to the pond, dark lines scoring the white. Ruth opened the door, ushering Clara inside as the first breath of evening crept in. Elias stayed out a while longer, watching the ice glow faintly under the fading light. The surface looked solid, beautiful even. He didn't see how thin it was in the middle. Chapter 3. Before the Fall. The morning dawned sharp and bright, sunlight bouncing off every frozen surface until it looked like the whole world had been polished overnight. The cold had softened just enough to make the snow damp underfoot, the kind that packed into perfect snowballs. For the first time in months, the Benton farm didn't feel like a sick room. Clara sat at the kitchen table near the window, her blanket tucked around her legs. The small radio hummed on the counter, static giving way to an old country station. Someone was singing about home, about coming back through the snow, the kind of song that felt older than it really was. Ruth was folding laundry by the stove, humming along, and the smell of something baking, cinnamon maybe, hung in the air. She caught herself smiling when she looked at her daughter. Clara had color in her cheeks again, a little spark in her eyes. Outside, Elias was hauling wood. The steady rhythm of his axe carried through the air. Thwack, 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 followed by the sound of logs tumbling into the pile. Every swing looked sure, full of purpose. Ruth opened the door to call out, "You'll be sore by supper." Elias grinned without looking up. "Better sore than soft." His voice echoed off the trees, and Clara giggled quietly to herself. She'd forgotten how much she loved that sound. Her father laughing, even at his own nonsense. "Can I go out later?" she asked. Ruth hesitated. "Maybe just to the porch. 10 minutes. 15. 10, Ruth said firmly, but her eyes softened. "We'll see how you're breathing first." Clara nodded and turned back to her drawing, a crooked sketch of the pond, the trees, a small figure waving from the shore. Her pencil smudged where the hand trembled a little, but she didn't care. By afternoon, the sky had gone pale and high, kind of winter blue that made distance feel endless. The dog barked from the yard, chasing sparrows that darted across the snow. Elias came in with his coat half open, breath still fogging. "Woodpile's high enough to last till February," he said, pulling off his gloves. "We'll have to find something else to complain about." "You'll always find something," Ruth said, smiling faintly. She set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. He took it, the warmth biting his fingers, and glanced toward Clara. "You been drawing again?" She nodded shyly, showing him the paper. He leaned over, squinting. "That me?" "Yes," she said. "See? You're by the pond." He studied the sketch. "You gave me more hair than I deserve." She grinned, and it made his chest ache in the best way. "You about ready for that rink yet?" he asked lightly. Ruth looked up from the counter. "Eli, not today," he said quickly, "but soon. I checked the edges again this morning, solid as the barn floor. I'll have it cleared smooth before the weekend." Ruth's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Clara's face lit up. "Really?" "Really," he said. "You'll be skating before Christmas, you mark my words." He took another sip of coffee, eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the sunlight glanced off the pond in hard flashes of white and silver. Beautiful, harmless, if you didn't know better. He reached across the table, ruffling Clara's hair. "Now," he said, "you help your mama keep from burning supper again, and we'll call it a good day." As dusk came down, the horizon flared orange, then dimmed to rose. The fields turned the color of ash. Inside the house, the lamps glowed golden, and the smell of Ruth's biscuits filled every corner. They ate together at the kitchen table, the three of them. No coughing, no silence hanging too long. The radio played softly, a hymn between commercials, and for once, the air didn't feel heavy. Clara laughed when Elias pretended to steal her biscuit. Ruth rolled her eyes but smiled all the same. After supper, Clara went to bed early, tired in that good, healthy way. Ruth tucked her in, brushed a hand through her hair, and whispered, "You did well today." Downstairs, Elias stood by the window, mug in hand, looking out into the dark. The pond shimmered faintly under moonlight, smooth, calm, waiting. He smiled to himself quietly. "A good day," he said under his breath. "Finally, a good day." Outside, the temperature rose by 0.5 degrees. Snow softened on the roof, and somewhere under the ice, water moved, slow and soundless. The next day passed quietly, without incident. By the following evening, a thin veil of cloud had rolled in from the west, softening the light until the whole farm seemed caught in a pale hush. Snow dusted the roof of the barn and clung to the bare lilac bushes by the porch. Inside, the air was golden and thick with the smell of supper, fried onions, baked beans, and something sweet cooling on the counter. Elias came in from the cold just as Ruth was setting the table. His face was raw from wind, his coat dusted with frost, and his gloves stiff with ice. He leaned against the doorway, a picture of a man who'd spent his day trying to stay useful. "Smells like Christmas came early," he said, rubbing his hands over the stovetop to chase back the feeling in his fingers. Ruth smiled faintly. "You're lucky there's enough left for you." He looked at her, really looked, and saw how the day's warmth had touched her face again. The worry was still there, threaded deep, but softened by the domestic rhythm. For a moment, It almost felt like before. Clara came down the stairs, slow but steady, holding the railing like a friend. She wore her thick red sweater, hair brushed and ribboned. Ruth fussed over her. "Sit here by the stove. Don't you dare get chilled," while Elias watched quietly, pride softening his shoulders. "You're walking strong," he said. "I feel strong," Clara answered, her voice shy but certain. Ruth ladled supper into bowls, and the three of them sat close to the lamp's glow. Outside, snow tapped against the window in quiet bursts. It was one of those rare evenings that settled easy. No coughing fits, no silences too heavy to name. Clara ate well, laughing softly when her father complained that Ruth had gone heavy on the beans again. Ruth rolled her eyes. "Next time you can cook," she said. He pointed his spoon at her. "You say that every time, and yet here we are. Both alive and the stew still edible." Clara giggled and Ruth shook her head, but couldn't hide her smile. They finished supper slow, as if none of them wanted to break the spell. When the plates were cleared, Elias rose, stretching his back, and went to the old cedar chest by the door. He crouched down, digging beneath a folded tarp and an old oilskin coat. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked. He didn't answer right away. He just lifted something from the chest and brushed the dust from it with his sleeve. The leather gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Clara leaned forward, eyes widening. Her skates! The same white pair she'd worn the winter before, scuffed but polished now, with new laces threaded neat through the hooks and blades shined to a mirror's edge. Elias set them on the table gently, as though they were made of glass. "Figured they might need a little work before the big day," he said. Clara stared at them speechless. "You fixed them?" He nodded. "Blades had a few nicks. Laces were shot. Now they're good as new." She reached out, tracing a finger along the smooth leather. "They look perfect." Ruth's hands had gone still in her dish towel. "Elias," she began softly. He looked at her, something half-defiant in his eyes. She deserved something to look forward to. Ruth didn't argue. She just stood there, the lamplight cutting across her face, and said, "It's kind of you." Clara's cheeks flushed pink. "Oh, thank you, Daddy." He smiled, his voice rough with feeling. "I promised, didn't I?" She nodded. Ruth sent her up to bed not long after, tucking the blanket around her shoulders. Clara fell asleep almost instantly, the skates resting on the chair beside her bed, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Downstairs, Elias poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped glass and stood by the window. Ruth joined him, drying her hands on her apron. "She's stronger," he said quietly. "She is," Ruth agreed. "But don't mistake a candle for a fire." He turned to her, frowning. "You think I'd risk her?" "I think you'd do anything for her," she said, "and that's what worries me." He looked back out the window. The pond was just visible beyond the yard, its surface smooth under the pale sky. "You'll see," he murmured. "It'll hold." Ruth didn't answer. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. The wind shifted. Somewhere deep under the frozen surface of the pond, water moved. A slow, hidden current winding its way through stone and silence. Upstairs, Clara dreamed she was gliding. The sky was endless, the ice perfect, her father's laughter echoing through the cold. When she looked down, she saw her reflection glimmering beneath the ice, clear, bright, and still. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The morning light came pale and thin, the kind that never quite warms a room. Frost traced the windows like lace, and the trees stood heavy with ice, their branches bowing toward the earth. For once, the wind had gone quiet. Ruth Benton stood at the stove stirring oatmeal, her breath visible in the unheated kitchen air. The kettle hissed softly. Behind her, the ticking of the old wall clock marked out a rhythm that somehow made the silence feel louder. Clara came down the stairs wrapped in a quilt, her hair tangled, her cheeks flushed from sleep. She moved slower now, still learning how to stand without swaying. "Morning," she said, voice small but bright. "Morning, love." Ruth smiled over her shoulder. "Did you sleep?" "I dreamed," Clara said. "I was skating. You were there too, and Daddy. The ice was clear all the way down, like glass." Ruth stirred the pot once more. "That sounds like a good dream." Clara nodded and went to the table, pulling her knees out under the quilt. It felt real. The back door creaked open, and Elias stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. The cold came in with him, sharp, raw, alive. His coat was dusted white, his breath clouding around him. "You're up early," Ruth said, setting 3 bowls on the table. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, brushing frost from his beard. "Sky's clear as glass. I think the ice is ready." Ruth's spoon froze in midair. It's been warmer this week." "Only during the day," Elias said. "Dropped again last night. I'll make a few passes near the edge just to be sure." Clara looked up. "Can I come?" He smiled. "Not yet. Maybe later." Ruth's eyes found his across the table, saying everything she didn't with words. He pretended not to see it. They ate quietly. Oatmeal, toast, a bit of jam from the summer jars. The radio crackled from the counter, catching a weather report. Elias reached over and turned the dial down before the voice finished. "They've been wrong before," he said lightly. Ruth gave a dry little laugh. "Not often enough." When breakfast was done, Clara cleared the table, careful not to drop the dishes. She'd grown pale again, and Ruth touched her forehead, feeling that cool, fragile skin. "Maybe you should rest a bit," Ruth said. "I want to watch him," Clara said. Her mother hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but bundle up. The cold bites harder when it's pretending to be kind." Elias was already outside, the tractor engine idling, low and steady. The air shimmered faintly around the exhaust. He knelt by the plow, tightening the chain that held it, his movements practiced and sure. The sky overhead was colorless, no blue, no gray, just the pale shade of waiting. He could smell the thaw already, faint, but there, like damp metal. But the surface of the pond looked solid, the snow crusted thick and even. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You'll test it first, won't you?" she called. He waved her off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be careful." Clara stood beside her mother, a scarf covering half her face. She clutched her mittens to her chest, excitement bubbling under her skin. "It looks perfect," she whispered. Ruth didn't answer. She was watching the way the light hit the pond, how the edges gleamed faintly wet, how the air seemed to hum in that peculiar way it does before a storm. Elias climbed in the tractor, turned the key, and the old machine roared to life. The sound filled the valley, deep, steady, unbothered. He eased forward, the plow cutting in the snow in neat, curling lines. Clara bounced on her toes. "He's really doing it." Ruth laid a hand on her shoulder. "Don't get too close." "I just want to see." "I know," Ruth said softly, "but stay where it's safe." The first pass went fine, then the second. The plow gleamed in the low light, the snow rolling back in bright waves. From the porch, it looked beautiful, almost like art, the clean lines against untouched white. Elias glanced toward the house once, caught Clara's small wave, and lifted a hand in return. The moment felt like a promise. Ruth turned to go inside. "Come on now," she said. "Let's get some cocoa started. He'll want it when he's done." Clara lingered for one last look at her father before following. The sound of the tractor followed her in, steady and sure. Then the wind chained. Just a breath, soft but strange, warm against her cheek. The sun climbed higher, a pale coin behind the thin sheet of cloud. By mid-morning, the cold had changed, no longer sharp, but damp and heavy, the kind that carried the faint smell of earth beneath the snow. Ruth noticed it first. She stood at the sink washing dishes, her hands red from the water, and paused mid-motion. The window above the basin was fogging from the inside, something it never did when the freeze held. She rubbed it clear with her sleeve and looked out. Elias was down by the pond. The tractor moved in slow, deliberate lines, the plow scraping rhythmically against the ice. From this distance, he looked small, a lone figure against the white expanse, a plume of exhaust trailing behind him like smoke from a candle. The sound carried up faintly, the steady chug of the engine, the soft crackle of ice shifting under the tires. Ruth's stomach tightened. Clara was sitting by the door, lacing her boots, her mittens tucked in her lap. The skates rested beside her, gleaming faintly in the filtered light. "He's almost done," she said, glancing up at her mother. "Then we can go." Ruth dried her hands and came closer. "Not yet. It's too soon." "But look," Clara said, pointing toward the window. "He's right in the middle now. That's where the ice is the strongest." Ruth didn't answer. Her gaze followed the line of tractor as it circled near the center. From here, she could see faint water sheen along one edge where the snow melt had pooled, a subtle shift in color, pale blue turning gray. The dog began barking from the yard, sharp and insistent. "Rex, hush," Clara called, but the animal wouldn't stop. He ran to the fence, then back to the porch, whining low in his throat. Outside, Elias turned the tractor again, steering it toward the south end. The engine growled. He leaned forward, peering down at the plow blade. From the seat, the ice looked sound, thick, clouded white, the snow clearing in even rows. Still, he felt it. The faint, unsettling tremor through the steering column. A vibration that wasn't quite right. He throttled back, testing. The engine dropped to a low hum. The air felt strange, too still, too soft. He'd been warned, he knew. The spring beneath this pond never froze right through, not even in years colder than this one. But he'd come this far and it looked fine. He shifted gears, eased forward. The tires rolled once, twice. A deep sound answered him, not a snap or a crack, but a hollow groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. He froze, one hand gripping the wheel. The sound faded, replaced by the idle sputter of the engine. "Come on now," he muttered. "You felt worse." He reversed slightly, felt the resistance, then the give. Water seeped up around the tread marks and glazed instantly. From the porch, Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. "Elias!" she shouted through the glass, her voice muffled but urgent. Clara jumped to her feet. "What's wrong?" Ruth didn't answer. She pushed open the door and stepped out barefoot onto the boards, her breath coming fast. Elias saw her wave, saw her mouth form his name, and that was when he heard it again. That low, terrible thud, like a heartbeat beneath the ice. He shifted to reverse. The tires spun once, catching nothing. Then the tractor dipped. Just slightly, a tilt forward, the sound of metal straining, the faint hiss of air through the cracks forming beneath. "Elias!" Ruth's voice tore through the cold. He threw the gear into neutral, reached for the door handle, but the motion was already underway. The slow, unstoppable sag of ice surrendering under weight. The sound came next, not one sharp break, but a chorus of splitting, echoing cracks that rippled outward in every direction. Clara screamed. The tractor lurched forward, front wheels vanishing into white spray. Steam rose instantly as freezing water met hot metal. The back end lifted once, then crashed down with a deafening splash that sent shards of ice flying. For a moment, Elias was still visible, half out of the cab, one hand reaching toward the surface. His eyes found Ruth's. Then the ice folded over him, sealing the hole with a shuddering sound like breath sucked through teeth. The world went quiet. The tractor's tailpipe gurgled, once beneath the surface, then nothing. Clara's scream hung in the air long after the sound had died. Ruth was already running, through snow up to her knees, shouting his name, slipping and stumbling toward the edge. Clara followed her, lungs burning, the cold cutting like knives through her chest. But by the time they reached the pond, it was over. The water turned a moment longer, then stilled, the edges crusted with new frost even as they watched. Ruth fell to her knees, pounding the ice with her fists. "Elias! Elias!" Her voice cracked, broke, vanished into the air. Clara could only stand there, shaking, the skates still clutched in her hands. The wind came back then, a low, mournful rush that swept across the fields, carrying snow over the pond until even the hole was gone. The world looked unchanged. For a few long seconds after the ice closed, no one moved. The wind had gone silent again, as if the whole valley was still holding its breath. The only sound was Ruth's, the gasping, uneven sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She was still on her knees at the pond's edge, her skirt frozen stiff where it touched the ice, her hands raw and bleeding from where she'd struck it. Steam rose faintly around her. Clara stood a few feet back, the skate still in her grip, her eyes fixed on the water. Her breath came fast, shallow. She couldn't seem to make her hands let go. "Mom?" Her voice was barely there. Ruth didn't answer. She pressed her palms against the ice again, as though sheer will could warm it, could call him back. "Mom," Clara whispered again, stepping closer, the ice groaned faintly beneath her boot. "Stay back," Ruth's voice snapped, breaking the trance. "Don't!" Clara froze mid-step. Ruth closed her eyes, drawing in a ragged breath. She looked out across the pond, flat, perfect, unbroken now except for the dark ring of water already crusting over near the center. It didn't look real. Nothing that terrible should look so calm. The dog barked again from the fence line, sharp and frantic, then fell silent. Finally, Ruth turned. Her face was gray, eyes hollowed. "Go," she said. "Go to the neighbors. Get help." Clara blinked, not understanding. "Go!" Ruth shouted, her voice cracking on the wood. The sound jolted Clara into motion. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the packed snow, the cold cutting into her lungs until every breath felt like glass. The world blurred past, the bare trees, the barn, the pale sky that had gone the color of tin. By the time she reached the road, her chest burned. She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept running until the distant shape of Mrs. Lasky's farmhouse appeared through the trees. Mrs. Lasky had just come to the door when she saw her. Clara, red-faced and sobbing, words tumbling one over another, hands shaking so violently she could barely point back toward home. "Daddy, ice. He fell. The woman didn't wait for more. She grabbed her coat from the hook and shouted for her son Tom, who was already hauling on his boots before she finished the sentence. By the time they reached the pond, the light had begun to change, that pale late afternoon glow that made everything look washed and distant. Ruth was still there, kneeling on the ice, her hair coming loose, her breath a soft mist. She didn't turn as they approached. Tom stepped a few yards back, scanning the scene. The hole was small now, already crusting over, the water black and silent beneath. He swallowed. "We'll need ropes," he said quietly. "And poles." Ruth spoke without looking up. "It's too late." Her voice was flat. Simple fact, no tremor. That was somehow worse. Tom hesitated, then nodded and went for the barn. Mrs. Lasky knelt beside Ruth, touching her shoulder gently. "Come inside, love. You'll freeze out here." Ruth's eyes didn't move from the pond. "If I leave, he won't find his way back." Mrs. Lasky's eyes filled. "He won't want you out here in the cold." "But he'd do the same for me," Ruth said. No one argued with that. By the time the other neighbors arrived, lanterns in hand, bundled in coats, the light had gone almost entirely. The men worked in silence, probing the broken ice with long poles, the sound of cracking and shifting filling the air. Someone brought ropes, another fetched blankets. Clara sat near the fence, wrapped in one of them, her body trembling though she didn't feel cold anymore. The dog sat pressed against her leg, whining softly. She could see the pond from where she sat. The lantern light flickered on its surface, and for a moment it almost felt beautiful again. Glassy, still, reflecting the stars just starting to appear. But she could hear the water moving underneath, faint and restless like something breathing. When the men gave up, one by one, no one said the words. They just looked at Ruth, waiting for permission to stop, and she didn't give it. She stayed there until the last light faded from the sky. By nightfall, the house was full, neighbors moving in and out, stoking the fire, murmuring condolences in low voices. Someone had brought hot tea. Someone else had fetched the pastor. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, still wearing her silk skirt, her hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. The room smelled of smoke and damp wool. Clara sat on the stairs, knees pulled to her chest, watching the adults move like shadows. Every so often, one of them would glance her way, then look quickly back to the floor. Her skates lay beside her on the step, the laces untied. She stared at them until her eyes blurred. The voices from the kitchen rose and fell, names and prayers and words that didn't sound like language anymore. After a while, she whispered to the empty room, "You promised." And though she meant it for her father, the words seemed to echo off the walls, as if the house itself had heard and didn't know what to do with them. Outside, the temperature dropped again. The pond refroze smooth and silent, as though it had never been broken at all. Chapter 5. The Winter Pond. The day of the funeral came hard and white, the kind of cold that turned every breath to smoke. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of tin. Even the crows were quiet. The church sat on the edge of town, its steeple rimmed with frost. Trucks lined the narrow road leading up to it, their engines ticking in the cold. Men stood stamping their feet in the snow, faces half hidden by scarves and hats, waiting for the service to begin. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wool and cedar polish. The benches creaked under the weight of coats. People spoke in low tones that didn't carry. It wasn't the kind of crowd that knew what to say. It was the kind that showed up anyway, because that's what you did when the land took one of your own. Ruth sat in the front pew, hats folded in her lap, her black gloves still damp from the frost. She hadn't cried since the night it happened. Her face had gone still, smoothed of expression, her eyes fixed on the small wooden cross at the front. Clara sat beside her, her feet barely touching the floor. The hem of her dress brushed the tops of her boots. She stared at the coffin, plain pine, no varnish, built by Tom Lasky and the neighbor men, and thought how small it looked. Her hands twisted the ends of her mittens until the yarn began to fray. The pastor spoke, words about mercy and faith and the mystery of God's will, but his voice felt far away, muffled by the pounding of her own heart. Every so often, she thought she heard the pond again, that low, groaning crack echoing somewhere inside her chest. When the service ended, people filed past the family one by one, murmuring the same soft condolences. He was a good man. The Lord keep you. He was only trying to make her smile again. The last one caught in Clara's ears and wouldn't let go. Outside, the ground was too hard to dig deep. The men worked with picks and shovels, breaking through a crust of ice and frozen soil. Sound rang sharp against the church walls, a dull metallic rhythm that made everyone wince. Clara watched them lower the coffin, the rope slipping slowly through gloved hands. The wind picked up and carried a handful of loose snow across the open grave, dusting the wood before the first shovel of dirt fell. Ruth didn't move. When the pastor closed his Bible, the crowd lingered a moment longer, hats off, eyes down, and they began to drift toward their trucks. Engines turned over, doors slammed. Life resumed its steady hum because it had to. Ruth stayed until the last engine noise had faded, her coat hemmed stiff with frost. Clara reached for her mother's hand, but Ruth didn't seem to feel it. The pastor waited nearby, his voice gentle. "We can finish the covering tomorrow, Mrs. Benton. Best not stay out much longer." Ruth nodded, though she hadn't really heard him. Clara's hand was still in hers when she finally turned toward home. The road back stretched gray and endless, lined with fields glazed white. Every fence post carried its little crown of snow. Every step sounded hollow. Behind them, the grave remained open, the air above it still, the edges clean and sharp as glass. The first week after the funeral passed without time. Morning and night blurred into the same gray light, the same wind whispering along the eaves. The fire never went out, but the house stayed cold all the same. Ruth kept it burning because that was what felt left to do: feed the fire, wash the dishes, tend the silence. Every few hours she'd stoke the stove, scrape of the poker breaking the stillness. It was a sound Clara began to recognize as her mother's heartbeat. Neighbors came and went. They left casseroles, loaves of bread, jars of stew, each one with a note folded under the lid. Ruth stacked them neatly on the counter, untouched. The kitchen smelled of food no one could eat. Clara stayed close to the stairs, as if halfway between worlds. The upstairs felt too empty, her father's boots still by the door, his coat on its hook. But the downstairs air was heavier, weighted with her mother's silence. She took to sitting in the hallway where the light from the stove flickered against the wallpaper. The dog Rex had stopped barking. He waited by the back door every evening, his nose pressed to the wood, tail still as a stick. Sometimes Clara thought she heard him whine in his sleep, low and broken, like he was dreaming of the pond. The pond itself looked peaceful again. The men had finished filling the grave the next day, but no one touched the water. By the time the new year came, it had smoothed itself clean. No crack, no shadow, no sign of what it had swallowed. On clear days, Clara could see it from the kitchen window, a white plain framed by bare trees. The sunlight lay across it like glass. The beauty of it made her stomach twist. Ruth didn't look at it. She drew the curtains before dark and again before dawn, as if to keep the cold from finding its way back in. A few nights after the funeral, Clara woke to the sound of movement downstairs. The fire had burned low, throwing long, restless shadows across the walls. She crept halfway down the staircase and peered through the banister. Her mother stood by the stove, still in her dress, one of Elias's work shirts clutched in her hands, the old flannel one he wore for everything, mended elbows, faint smell of cedar and smoke. Ruth held it close to her face for a moment, then opened the stove door. The firelight caught her eyes, bright, wet, too bright. She fed the shirt into the flame slowly, pressing it down with the poker until it caught. The cloth curled and blackened, the buttons popping in tiny bursts. Clara didn't move. She held her breath until the sound of the fabric turned into a soft hiss. Ruth stood there for a long while, staring into the fire, as if waiting for something to happen. Then she shut the stove door and leaned against it, one hand over her mouth. Clara backed up the stairs, one slow step at a time, the boards creaking under her feet. When she reached her room, she crawled under the blankets and pressed her face into the pillow. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the house, thick and familiar. Somewhere outside, the wind had changed again, softer now, carrying the faint creak of ice shifting out on the pond. Chapter 6. The House Without Sound. The world forgot to make sound after Elias died. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the fields. The trees stood motionless, heavy with frost that didn't glitter anymore, just dulled the light. Days came and went, slow and gray, one pouring into the next like melted snow slipping under the door. Inside the farmhouse, everything had its own kind of hush. The ticking clock on the mantel was too loud. The scrape of a chair leg against the floor sounded like breaking glass. Every noise carried meaning it hadn't earned. Ruth moved through her days like someone walking in a dream. She boiled water, fed the fire, wiped out surfaces that didn't need it. She spoke only when she had to the dog, to the kettle, to the Lord in short, wordless prayers. She'd stopped wearing black after the first week, not out of disrespect, but because it made her feel buried too. Now she wore gray, always gray. Clara kept mostly to the corner by the kitchen window, where the light was strongest in the mornings. She'd sit there with her drawing paper spread out, though she rarely drew anymore. The pencil would hover above the page, waiting for something that never came. She didn't look directly at the pond, but it was always there, caught in the corner of her vision, white and endless. Sometimes, when the stove crackled just right, she thought she could hear it, a faint sound beneath the quiet, like shifting breath under glass. When she told her mother that, Ruth had only said, "It's the wind." But Clara knew the wind's voice. This was something else. One morning in early February, Ruth stood by the sink, her hands sunk in dishwater gone cold. The window was fogged, but she could feel the change in the air, a kind of softening that meant winter was beginning to lose its hold. Drips of water fell steadily from the eaves outside, a thin, steady rhythm, patient, insistent. She dried her hands and listened. There it was again. Drip, drip. The first sound of thaw. It made her heart beat faster, though she couldn't have said why. Clara appeared in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. "It's warmer," she said quietly. Ruth nodded but didn't look at her. "It's too soon." They stood there together, listening to the sound of melting, that strange, traitorous promise that the world would go on. By the end of February, the air had changed. Not by much, just enough that the snow no longer crunched underfoot, only sighed. The kind of weather that made windows sweat by mid-afternoon, when the sun pressed weakly against the glass. Ruth noticed first. The sound of water was everywhere now, dripping from the eaves, sliding down the gutter, whispering in the downspouts like voices she didn't want to hear. She'd go to the window and pull the curtains tight, muttering, "It's not time yet. Not yet." But the earth never waits for permission. The pond began to darken at its center, the top layer of ice turning from white to gray, the faint gleam of water showing through. From the house, it looked harmless enough, just winter softening into spring. But Ruth couldn't stand to look at it. Every time she caught sight of that shifting gray, her chest clenched as though the ground might open again. Clara, though, watched it every day. She sat by the window like she always had, but now her eyes stayed on the pond, tracing the lines where melt met frost. Sometimes she thought she could see movement beneath the surface, the slow pulse of water finding its way back through the cracks. It didn't scare her. If anything, it felt like the world was breathing again. One morning, Ruth came in from the porch carrying a basket of firewood. Her boots left wet tracks across the floor. "Don't stare at that pond," she said, her voice tired but sharp. "You'll dream of it." Clara didn't look away. "It's melting." "I know. He'd like that, wouldn't he? That the ice didn't last forever?" Ruth froze halfway to the stove. She hadn't heard Elias's name spoken in weeks, maybe months. It hit her like a sound from a place she'd forgotten existed. "Don't," she said softly. Clara turned toward her mother. "You don't say his name anymore." Ruth's throat worked, but no words came. "I think he'd want us to," Clara went on. "He'd hate being forgotten." Ruth set the basket down too hard, the logs clattering. "He isn't forgotten." Clara didn't argue. She just pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the window. Outside, a single crow crossed the sky, its shadow rippling over the pond's darkening skin. For the first time in months, Ruth followed her daughter's gaze and watched a patch of ice near the center sink, slowly as the water underneath moved. The sound it made was faint, a long, soft exhale, like someone letting go. Chapter 7. The Meltwater. March arrived with a sound. A long, low dripping that came from everywhere at once. From the roof, from the eaves, from the edges of the porch where icicles thinned and broke with a sigh. It was a sound of everything loosening. Ruth hated it. She woke each morning to the sound and felt her chest tighten. She'd lie still, waiting for it to stop, but it never did. It only grew, steady as breath, soft as confession. The snow had begun to rot, sinking in on itself, gray patches showing where earth waited underneath. The road to town turned to ruts and slush, the kind that froze again at night and trapped the truck tires until noon. Inside the house, the air grew damp, the walls wept in corners, paint blistering in small curls near the baseboards. Ruth cleaned it all, scrubbed, sanded, repainted, as if she could keep decay from settling in. But grief doesn't rot the way wood does. It just shifts its weight. Clara watched her mother from the doorway. The way she worked without stopping, without thinking. Each stroke of the brush, each swing of the broom was too hard, too fast. "You don't have to keep cleaning," Clara said once. Ruth didn't look up. "Then who will?" "You could rest." "I rest at night," but she didn't, and they both knew it. The fields beyond the house had begun to show stripes of brown earth between the white. The air smelled of thawed mud, sour and familiar. The pond, once smooth as marble, now lay under a skin of dull, sagging ice. Beneath it, dark water pulsed like something alive. Clara hadn't gone near it since that day, but now, every time she passed the window, her eyes were drawn to it, as if it had something to tell her. One afternoon, when Ruth was in town collecting flour and lamp oil, Clara wrapped herself in her father's old coat and went outside. The wind was mild, carrying the scent of wet grass. The snow gave way under her boots, heavy and soft. When she reached the edge of the pond, the air changed. It was cooler there, the ground slick with meltwater. She crouched, her reflection fractured on the uneven surface. For a long time she said nothing. Then quietly, as though testing her voice, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Her breath fogged the air, and the pond answered with a small sound, the faintest pop of air escaping under ice. "I didn't mean to ask," she said. "I didn't know it would take you." Another drip fell from the willows, landing on the surface with a sound like a heartbeat. Clara's throat closed. "You promised we'd skate again," she whispered, "so I'll wait. I'll wait until it freezes right." She stayed there until the wind picked up and the edges of her coat darkened with water. Then she stood, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and turned back toward the house. Behind her, the pond shifted, a small crack opening near the center, water gleaming through, the first true sign of spring. The rain came hard and sudden one night in late March, drumming against the roof until it sounded like the house was breathing. The kind of prairie rain that forgets how to stop once it starts. No thunder, no lightning, just relentless falling. By morning, the yard was a shallow lake. Water pooled in the ruts of the driveway, gathered under the porch, and crept toward the barn in slow, shimmering lines. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, her hands gripping the sink. "It'll flood," she said. Clara, still half asleep, peered over her shoulder. "It's just rain." Her mother shook her head. "It's the meltwater. Comes up from underneath. You think you're safe until it's at your door." She grabbed her coat and boots, already moving. Clara followed, calling her after her. "Where are you going?" "To move the feed barrels before the barn floods." "I'll help." "You'll stay put," Ruth said. But the girl was already pulling on her raincoat, small hands fumbling with the buttons. Outside, the rain was cold enough to sting. The world had gone soft and gray, sky and ground melting into each other. The pond had overrun its banks, dark water spilling across the grass. Ruth waded through ankle-deep mud, cursing under her breath, her skirt heavy with water. The sound of it, the slosh, the steady drum of rain, brought something sharp to her memory. Another sound of rushing water, of breaking ice, of the moment everything in her life had given way. She froze mid-step, heart pounding, breath catching. Clara caught up panting, rain dripping from her hair. "Mama?" Ruth blinked, disoriented. For a second, the field and the pond and the barn all blurred together. Then she saw it again, the hole in the ice, the steam rising, the way his hand had reached up once, just once. "Go inside," she said hoarsely. Clara shook her head. "I'm not scared." "You should be." Ruth's voice rose above the rain, sharp and wild. "You think water listens? You think it cares what it takes?" Clara stepped back, stunned. I didn't make it happen." Ruth pressed her hands to her temples. I know that. She stopped, her eyes closing, the rest of the world lost in her throat. Clara's lip trembled. "Then why do you look at me like you wish I'd fallen instead?" The words hit hard and clean. Ruth's breath left her in a sound between a sob and a gasp. "Don't you say that," she whispered. "Don't you ever say that." But the rain swallowed her voice. They stood there, two shapes blurred by downpour, water running down their faces, one crying, one trying not to. Finally, Ruth crossed the distance and caught her daughter by the shoulders, pulling her close. "You're all I have left," she said, her voice breaking. "All I have left." The rain softened then, as if the sky itself had spent its grief. By afternoon, the flood began to drain away. The pond had spilled wide into the pasture, leaving behind patches of silt and broken reeds. The barn floor was slick with mud, feed barrels floating like small boats until they caught on the fence. Ruth and Clara worked in silence, dragging what they could out to dry. Every so often, Ruth glanced toward the waterline, half expecting to see something surface. A shape, a color, anything, but the pond kept its secrets. That night, the air was heavy with damp earth and wood smoke. Ruth sat by the stove, wringing out a wet rag until her knuckles went white. Clara sat opposite, her hair still damp. The dog curled at her feet. Neither spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of water still dripping from the roof. When Ruth finally looked up, she saw that her daughter was staring into the flames, lips moving silently. Ruth strained to listen. One word, over and over. "Daddy." The sound of it cracked something open inside her, small, quiet, but irreversible. She whispered it too, for the first time in months. "Elias." The fire popped once, sending a small ember drifting into the air like a spark trying to rise back toward the rain. Chapter 8. The Spring After. By April, Stillwater was waking again. The willows by the creek had gone green at their tips, and the air carried the smell of damp earth and last year's hay. The world moved on the way it always did, not cruelly, just indifferently, and the Bennons' land began to stir whether they were ready or not. Ruth spent most mornings in the garden, kneeling among the thawed soil with bare hands, turning it over, dark and wet. She planted too early, she knew that, but she needed to see something living push through. She spoke to the seeds as she set them in, her voice soft and steady, like a prayer. Clara watched her from the fence. She'd grown thinner, her hair lighter from months of pale winter light. The sickness hadn't returned, but something else had taken root, a kind of quiet that didn't belong to a child. When Ruth looked up, their eyes met. "Don't just stand there," she said. "Bring the watering can." Clara obeyed, careful not to spill. The can was dented, the same one her father had used for oiling the tractor. She poured slow, watching the water disappear into the dirt. "That's enough," Ruth said after a while. "You drown things if you're not careful." Clara looked down at the mud and whispered, "It's what water does." Ruth's hand stilled. She almost said something. Almost. Then turned back to her rows. The earth was soft enough to take her silence. By midday, the pond had shrunk to half its winter size, The snow melt had carved small veins through the grass, leaving behind rivulets that caught the light like silver thread. Ruth avoided it still, never glancing that way, but Clara wandered down where her mother wasn't looking. The ice was gone now, all but a few stubborn patches clinging to the shaded edge. Beneath the surface, she could see reeds beginning to sway, the faint shimmer of minnows darting through the murk. The air smelled of mud and something sweet, first green things breaking through. She crouched and touched the water with her fingertips. It was cold enough to bite. Ripples spread outward, slow and deliberate, touching the far side of the pond where the ice used to hold. She remembered the sound it made when it broke, how the air seemed to fold inward, how her mother's scream carried through the trees. But now, there was only the lapping of water and a bird calling from the fence post. "I'm still here," she said softly. "We both are." A frog croaked from somewhere near all the reeds, and Clara smiled. It felt like an answer. That night, Ruth sat at the table mending a tear in her dress. The lamplight was warmer at her face, softer now. Clara came in quietly and laid something on the table. A smooth stone, flat and gray, worn by the water. "For the shelf," she said, "by his picture." Ruth looked at it a long moment before nodding. "All right." They placed it beside the framed photograph that had sat untouched all winter. Elias leaning against the tractor, one hand shading his eyes, smiling that half smile that never quite committed. The two of them stood there in the quiet, the lamp flickering, the house still. Outside, frogs sang to the dark, and for the first time since the ice broke, Ruth reached for her daughter's hand, not out of fear, not out of duty, but because the world had started moving again, and she wanted to hold on while it did. Chapter 9. The Longest Day. By June, the fields had turned the color of sunlit straw, and the sky stretched clean and blue from one edge of the prairie to the other. Heat shimmered on the road, bending light like water. Still water had shaken the frost from its bones. Tractors moved again. Cows dotted the far pastures, and the smell of cut hay carried through the valley. The rhythm of living returned to everyone except the Bentons. Their house, once gray and hollow, had softened in the light. Wildflowers grew along the porch, creeping through the cracks in the steps. Ruth hung laundry outside for the first time that year, the sheets swelling like sails in the wind. She worked more now, not with the grim purpose of winter survival, but with the restless kind of energy that keeps sorrow from catching up. By midday, her hands were always damp from the wash basin, her hair sticking to her neck. She'd hum old hymns while she worked, half under her breath, half to keep the silence away. Clara spent her days down near the creek. She'd found a patch of wild mint growing by the water's edge and gathered it carefully, one leaf at a time. The smell lingered on her fingers long after. Sometimes she'd lie in the grass, eyes half closed, listening to the bees. The world didn't seem haunted anymore. It just seemed changed. In late afternoon, Ruth would bring lemonade in an old mason jar, sitting on the porch while the sun sank low. The light made everything golden, the fence, the grass, even the worn boards of the house. Clara sat at her feet, sketchbook open. She'd started drawing again. Not the pond or her father, but small things, the mint leaves, the dog's paws, the curls of Ruth's hair as they caught the light. "Looks like him," Ruth said one evening, nodding toward the sketch. Clara looked up. "What does?" "The way you draw the sky," Ruth said. "Always bigger than the page can hold." Clara smiled, faint and private. "That's how he saw things." Ruth's eyes softened. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Maybe it's how you see them, too." The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It just was. The longest day of the year came without ceremony. The air smelled of grass and sun-warmed earth. The pond shimmered, no longer a wound in the land but a mirror. Dragonflies skimmed its surface, flashing blue and green. Ruth stood by the fence, watching Clara wade barefoot through the shallows, her hem dark with water. For a moment, panic flickered, that old, sharp instinct to call her back. But she didn't. Instead, she let her daughter walk where the light pooled, where ripples followed her every step. Clara bent down, hand in the water, and then she turned, and she smiled. "It's warm," she called back. Ruth smiled. "Then maybe it's time." "Time for what?" "For the world to stop punishing us," she said quietly, more to herself than to the girl. The wind moved through the grass, bending it all in one direction. The sun lowered, spilling its last light across the fields. For the first time since winter, Ruth felt something close to peace. Not joy, not forgiveness, but a kind of tired mercy. Chapter 10. The Stillwater Summer. Summer settled over Stillwater like a held breath. Days stretched long and soft, the kind that began in mist and ended in the hum of crickets. The grass along the fence line grew tall enough to whisper, and the air smelled faintly of wild clover and sun-warmed earth. The Bentons' house no longer felt hollow. It creaked again, floors expanding in the heat, windows open to the breeze. There was music sometimes, faint and scratchy from the radio, or Clara humming without realizing she was. Ruth began baking again. Small loaves at first, then pies, the crust imperfect but fragrant. She'd leave them on the windowsill to cool, the smell carrying clear across the yard. Some evenings she'd sit on the porch with her coffee, bare feet on the rail, the settling sun caught in her hair like a memory she could finally bear to keep. Clara ran more now, to the pasture, to the creek, to wherever the world felt wide enough. Her laughter carried across the field, startling the crows. She had grown into her quiet, not out of it. It was no longer the silence of grief, but the calm that follows surviving. Sometimes she'd find her mother watching from the porch and call out, "Come with me." Ruth would wave her off, half smiling. "You go on. The world needs you more than it needs me." But one evening, she did come. They walked down together, following the path through the tall grass. The pond was clear and full, reflecting the late night in molten streaks. Clara skipped stones across it, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. Each one danced before sinking. Ruth knelt beside her, picked up a flat stone and held it in her palm. "He taught me once," she said, "when we were about your age, my brothers and me. Said it was all in the wrist." She flicked the stone just right. It skipped twice, then sank. Ruth laughed, an unfamiliar sound, rusty from disuse. Clara turned toward her, grinning. "You still got it." Ruth shrugged. Maybe it never left. They sat there until the sky turned violet, the frogs starting their evening chorus. The water glowed faintly, fireflies beginning to blink along the reeds. Clara leaned against her mother's shoulder. "Do you think he'd like it here now?" Ruth looked out over the pond. The air was still, the surface calm, a perfect mirror. "He'd say, 'It's just right,'" she said softly. "He'd say Stillwater's living up to its name." By July, the garden had gone wild. Beans climbed the fence. Sunflowers reached the height of the windows. The world was full again, noisy, green, unashamed. Ruth led it. She learned that some things grew best without tending. Clara kept a small notebook in her pocket, filled with sketches and half-thoughts. She drew the sky most days, how it changed color over the pond, how the clouds moved like slow herds across the distance. Sometimes, when the heat made her drowsy, she'd lie back in the grass and imagine the pond from below, water holding light the way memory holds sound, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, just deep. And somewhere, inside that quiet, she began to understand what her father had meant when he said the ice would hold. It hadn't, but they had. That summer, a new family moved into the Harris place 2 miles down the road. They came with a rusted pickup and a boy around Clara's age who could fix almost anything that rattled. His name was Jack. Shy smile, sunburned nose, always carrying a wrench or an apple. One evening, he rode over with his father to help Ruth's brother mend the gate post. Clara watched from the steps, a smudge of charcoal still on her fingers from drying. Jack nodded when their eyes met, awkward and polite, before following the men down toward the barn. When they left, Ruth said, "Good people, the Harrises. Hard-working. They lost a son years back." Clara didn't ask more. She only looked toward the pond and thought how every family in Stillwater seemed to lose something. A few weeks later at the co-op, Clara overheard two women near the flour sacks whispering, "You'd never get me near that Benton pond. Some places remember." "It's just water," said the other. "Maybe, but that kind don't forget." Ruth's voice, cool and sharp, cut through the room. "They don't talk about what you don't understand." The women went quiet. The clerk looked down at his hands. And when Ruth turned to leave, Clara saw her mother's fingers trembling, not from anger, but from the weight of being the one left to defend the story. That night, Clara wrote in her notebook, "Stillwater keeps the sky. Maybe it keeps everything." Chapter 11. The Distance Between. By August, the air had turned heavy with heat and dust. The world had gone loud again. Grasshoppers clicking in the fields, trucks passing on the distant highway, the wind sighing through the wheat like breath. Stillwater shimmered under it all, every fence post and grain bin gleaming in the long light. The pond, once a wound, now looked almost holy, bright, still, rimmed in green. Clara had grown taller. The change had happened quietly, the way summer growth always does. Her sleeves no longer reached her wrists, her shoes scuffed at the toes. She'd begun spending her afternoons farther from the house, down by the old train tracks, or at the edge of the fields where the sky met everything. She carried her sketchbook everywhere, filled with lines and small notes about the land. Sun turned silver at 4. Water smells like clay. Ruth laughing. Rare. When she drew now, her lines had changed. Fewer soft edges, more confidence. Ruth noticed, though she tried not to. "She's got your eye for detail," Tom Lasky said one day when he stopped by with a sack of feed in a polite attempt at company. "She's got her father's wandering," Ruth said. He smiled gently. "There are worse things to inherit." Ruth didn't answer. She watched through the window as Clara walked the fence line, her braid swinging, her face turned toward the horizon. That horizon had always terrified her, not because it promised danger, but because it promised freedom. That week, the Harrises came by to borrow a hand auger. Jack, now 14 and taller than Ruth remembered, helped Tom lift it into the wagon bed. He nodded toward the garden where Clara knelt among the bean rows, hat shade in her face. "She draws near the pond sometimes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Doesn't seem scared of it." Ruth looked up sharply. "There's nothing to be scared of." He shrugged. "Folks talk." "They always do," she said, ending it there. When the wagon rolled away, Ruth stood for a long moment, the heat shimmering off the field, her breath slow and shallow. Later that evening, she pressed her hand to her ribs and sat down on the porch steps before the dizziness passed. She told herself it was only the weather, but she didn't mention it to Clara. The night before Clara's 13th birthday, a storm rolled through. Not the kind that breaks things, but the kind that cleanses. Rain dropped softly on the roof while wind moved through the open windows, carrying the smell of wet wheat and lightning. Ruth lay awake listening to it, her body heavy with the ache of sleeplessness. She thought of Elias, how he used to rise during storms, standing by the window, as if the thunder spoke a language only he understood. In the next room, Clara was sketching by candlelight, the storm reflected in the curve of her eyes. When Ruth peeked in, she saw the drawing, the pond, the field, and two figures, a woman and a child standing far apart, both facing the same water. "That's us?" Ruth asked softly. Clara smiled without looking up. It was. Ruth studied her daughter's face, realizing suddenly that she'd stopped being a child somewhere between the meltwater and this storm. The wind rattled the windows, and Ruth whispered, "Don't grow too fast." Clara looked up then, her expression quiet but sure. "Maybe you just stopped." It wasn't meant cruelly, and Ruth knew that, but the word stayed with her long after the candle burned down. The next morning dawned clear and golden. The storm had rinsed the world clean. Ruth made them biscuits and honey for breakfast, setting them on the table with an awkward kind of ceremony. Clara came down sleepy-eyed, her hair still damp from washing. "You don't have to fuss," she said. "13's worth fussing for," Ruth replied. They ate together, sunlight spilling across the table. The quiet between them wasn't empty, just stretching, like the distance between shore and reflection. Afterward, Clara went outside to feed the dog. Ruth watched from the window, hand resting on the sill. The air shimmered above the fields. Beyond the trees, she could just make out the pond, glassy and calm. Somewhere, a rumor of thunder still rolled, or maybe it was a memory, echoing across the years. Clara looked smaller out there somehow, but the kind of small that belongs to something bigger, to the open air, the wide sky, the endless Stillwater fields. And Ruth understood, without knowing how, that love sometimes meant standing still while the ones you've held learn to walk away. Chapter 12. Where the Light Falls. By late August, the air had changed again. The light fell different, longer, lower, brushed in gold as if the sun had grown tired of holding itself high. The days still burned, but the nights had turned cool enough for quilts and closed windows. Ruth felt it first, that quiet shift. The cicadas are louder in the evenings, the fields turning dull at their edges, the smell of ripening grain thick in the air. The world was slowing, folding itself toward rest. She found herself sitting on the porch more often, not to escape the house anymore, but to listen. There was a kind of peace in the ordinary noises, the creak of the swing, the soft thud of the dog settling at her feet, the screen door's sigh. Clara would join her sometimes, barefoot and sunburned, her notebook tucked under her arm. She'd grown into something beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with looks. All presence, all quiet confidence. "You drawing again?" Ruth asked one evening, as Clara opened her notebook and rested it against her knees. "Not tonight," Clara said. "Just thinking." Ruth smiled faintly. Dangerous thing for a Benton. They sat together in the soft light, the pond shining silver through the willows. The next afternoon, Jack Harris came by with his father to help mend the north fence before the first frost. He was taller now. His voice changed, but his shy manners hadn't gone anywhere. "Need any more wire?" he asked, tipping his cap toward Ruth. "I think we're fine," she said, though her hand trembled slightly when she reached for the pliers. Jack noticed, the brief wince when she bent, the way she caught her breath. He looked toward Clara, who was sketching on the fence post, and said softly, "My ma says the land takes it out of folks." Clara didn't look up. "Gives it back, too," she said. He nodded, smiling a little. "Guess it depends what you give it." When they finished, Jack lingered by the porch, tracing circles in the dust with his boot. "See you Sunday?" he asked. "Maybe," Clara said, "if the air don't turn." That night, Ruth watched her daughter watching him, and for the first time in years she felt the strange ache of time, how it moves whether you're ready or not. As September neared, Ruth tired more easily. She brushed it off as late summer heat, but Clara noticed the pauses, the moments her mother would stop halfway up the stairs or sit longer at the table, her tea cooling beside her. "Just tired," Ruth said each time. "The kind that sleep won't fix." Clara didn't push. She only drew more often. Her mother's hands, the porch swing, the fading sun over the pond. One morning while cleaning the barn, Clara stumbled on an old metal toolbox wedged behind the feed barrels. It was coated in dust. The latch rusted shut. When she lifted it, it gave off a faint smell of oil and cedar, her father's scent, somehow still alive in the metal. She traced the initials carved faintly into the lid. E.B. Ruth found her there, crouched in the dust. "Leave it for now," she said quietly. "Some things open when they're ready." Clara nodded, though the weight of it, the mystery, settled in her chest like another heartbeat. That night, Ruth dreamed of water. Not the day of the accident, not the sound of the ice breaking, just the pond in summer. Still, clear, reflecting the sky. She dreamed she stood at its edge and saw Elias there, not beneath but beside her, his hands in his pockets, his smile easy again. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, but her chest didn't hurt the way it used to. She rose before dawn, the world still gray, and made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, earthy and grounding. For a long moment she stood at the window and looked toward the pond. Mist hovered above it, soft and white, moving in slow curls. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She stepped outside without her coat, barefoot, on the cool grass. The ground was wet with dew, the air sharp with morning. She walked down to the pond's edge, the mist curling around her like breath. The water was still, unbroken. She crouched and reached out, touching the surface with the tip of her fingers. Ripples spread outward, faint and perfect. For the first time, she didn't see death in that reflection. She saw light. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Clara's voice came soft through the morning fog. "Mama?" Ruth turned, smiling through the mist. "It's all right," she said. "It's just time." Later that morning, Clara sat on the porch sketching the view. Her mother by the pond, the mist lifting, the world caught between night and day. She titled it, "Where the Light Falls." And when Ruth came back up the hill, she stopped to look over her daughter's shoulder. "That's beautiful," she said. Clara looked up at her. "It's us," she said simply. Ruth nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she whispered, "it is." The two of them stood there in the quiet of Stillwater's summer end, watching as the mist dissolved into sunlight and the world began, gently, stubbornly, again. Interlude: The Years Between. Time moved like weather in Stillwater, slow, circling, and without announcement. The seasons folded over one another until memory blurred into the rhythm of the land. Each winter froze the pond, and each spring set it free again. The world didn't forget, it just softened at the edges. Ruth's hair turned the color of the first frost. Her body began to slow in small ways. The breath she caught halfway up the stairs, the way her hands trembled when she hung laundry on the line. But she never spoke of getting older. In Stillwater, age wasn't discussed, it was simply endured. Clara grew taller, then older, then restless. After finishing school, she took a job at the hardware store in town. The kind of place where the radio hummed all day and the same customers came in for nails they didn't need just to talk about the weather. In the quiet hours between rushes, she sketched on the backs of receipts, door hinges, old hands, cracked windows, bits of life she didn't want to forget. Jack Harris stayed nearby. His family's land backed onto theirs, and even as the years changed everything else, he didn't seem to change much at all. He helped Ruth patch the roof one spring, brought hay after a storm, fixed the pump when it froze. Sometimes he'd find Clara sweeping the store porch after closing, and they'd walk partway home together, the gravel crunching underfoot, their words few but easy. By the time Clara turned 19, the town had grown too small for her wondering. And that autumn she left to see the city. A rented room, a small college course, a hope she couldn't quite name. She wrote her mother twice a week at first, then less. She wrote Jack once. He wrote her every month. The letters were simple, news of the harvest, the neighbors, the pond's early thaw. He never asked when she was coming back. He just told her about Stillwater as though it were a living thing that missed her. When Ruth's health began to fail, Jack started stopping by again, to bring groceries, to shovel the walk, to check on the dog. Clara called less that year, her voice tight with guilt she didn't have the words for. And then one spring morning, Ruth was gone. Clara came home to bury her beneath the cottonwoods where the field met the pond. The earth was soft, the sky still holding the scent of thaw. Jack stood beside her as the service ended, his hat in his hands, his silence steady as ever. When it was over, she whispered to him, "I'll come back." He nodded. "I know." After that, she left Stillwater again. A handful of years lost to cities and borrowed apartments, the kind of life that never quite fit. But Jack kept writing, and she kept every letter. Chapter 13. The Long Freeze. The road to Stillwater was the same, but smaller somehow. The poplars that once towered over the lane now leaned in toward each other like old women whispering. Gravel crunched under the tires of the borrowed truck as Clara turned down the familiar ruts, her fingers tight on the wheel. It had been 6 years since she'd last driven this way. 6 years of rented rooms, city lights, and the kind of loneliness that never asked for your permission. When the farmhouse came into view, she slowed. The place hadn't changed. Gray siding, leaning porch, the windows like tired eyes. But the sight of it hit her like a sound she'd been missing without knowing it. The air was cold enough to sting. A soft flurry drifted sideways across the yard, the first whisper of winter. She parked by the shed and sat for a long moment before getting out. Inside, the air was thick with stillness. The clock above the stove had stopped at 3:17. The table was set with one plate, one mug, both dusted with time. The Bible lay open to a verse she didn't need to read to remember. Ruth had been gone nearly a year now, and yet Clara half expected to hear her footsteps in the next room. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. Clara built a small fire in the stove and sat beside it with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. On the wall hung one of her childhood sketches. The pond, the fields, her father's shadow faint in the distance. The paper had yellowed, but the lines still held. She found herself standing at the window before she realized she'd moved. The pond was visible through the trees, half shrouded in mist. The surface was already skimming over with ice. Fragile, uncertain. Beyond it, a figure moved, a man on the road, his stride easy and familiar. Jack Harris. He was carrying something in his arms, a small wooden crate, probably eggs. He waved once when he saw her. For a moment, Clara couldn't move. When he reached the porch, he stopped a respectful distance away, tipping his hat the way he always had. "Thought you might need a few things from town," he said. His voice was deeper now, edged with years, but the calm was still there. She nodded, words catching in her throat. "You didn't have to." "I know." Silence fell between them, full but not heavy, the kind of silence that comes from people who once shared something they never named. He glanced past her shoulder toward the house. "Looks about the same." "It does. Ruth kept it well. She did." Another pause, soft as snowfall. Jack shifted the crate into her hands. "I'll come by in a few days, see if the pump's still running. Cold like this, you never know." Before she could thank him, he was already stepping off the porch, his boots leaving shallow prints in the new snow. She watched until he disappeared down the lane, swallowed by the quiet. That evening, Clara went out to the barn. The air inside smelled of oil and hay and ghosts. Dust floated through the dim light like ash. Behind the old workbench sat the toolbox. It was smaller than she remembered. The red paint dulled to rust, her father's initials, E.B., still faintly visible on the lid. She crouched beside it, brushing her fingers over the letters, half afraid it might crumble beneath her touch. The latch stuck once, twice, before finally giving. Inside, a roll of wire, a few dull nails, a broken pocket knife, and beneath it all, a stack of folded papers bound with string. Her breath caught. The paper was fragile, the ink faded but legible. Each page began the same. "To my Clara May." She sat on the barn floor until her legs went numb, reading until the light failed. The letters weren't confessions or sermons, just small pieces of thought. Notes about the weather, sketches of the rink he'd planned, hopes for her health, dreams he hadn't had time to finish. "If the ice holds, we'll hang lanterns. I'll play the old radio through the barn window. Maybe she'll laugh again." Her father's voice came through the words, steady, careful, certain. The ache that had followed her for years began to shift, not soften, but settle. When she finally stood, night had fallen. Cold bit through her coat as she crossed the yard, letters clutched against her chest. At the porch, she paused, looking back toward the pond. In the moonlight, the surface gleamed like glass, unbroken and whole. Inside, the stove hummed. She spread the letters on the table and lit a single lamp. The light pooled golden over the ink. Her hands trembled, but not from cold. She took a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Not a reply, but something else. A beginning. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the ice groaned softly in the dark, as though remembering. Chapter 14. The Letters. Morning came gray and windless. Frost rimmed the window panes, turning the world beyond into pale lace. Clara woke to the smell of cold iron and wood smoke, the kind of scent that never left old farmhouses no matter how many years passed between occupants. She dressed in layers and lit the stove. The match flared, a single bright sound in the silence. The letters waited on the table where she'd left them the night before, still bound by that thin piece of twine. She untied it carefully, as though the paper might bruise. The first page was dated December 17th, 1981. To my Clara May, if the cold stays another week, I think the pond will hold. I'll test it come morning. Don't tell your mother yet. I'd like it to be a surprise. Her father's handwriting was uneven, the kind that came from writing in barns and trucks and anywhere a thought demanded to be written down. The next letter was softer, more tired. She's been coughing again. I pray it's only the wind. Tell her to rest. Tell her the world will wait. Clara traced the words with her thumb, her breath shallow. The letters weren't written for anyone but her. They were confessions he'd never been brave enough to send. Some were just fragments, sketches of the pond, rough pencil circles marking where lanterns would hang, notes about the depth near the west bank. In one corner he'd written, "Ice, 4 inches thick, enough for laughter, but not for tractors." That one undid her. She sat for a long time. The letters spread like a paper constellation across the table. Each one pulsed with the same impossible mixture of hope and regret. By afternoon, the light had changed. The frost on the glass had melted into snow, weeping trails. Clara pulled on her boots and coat and stepped outside. The wind had calmed. The world was quiet in that particular Stillwater way, soundless yet alive. Down by the lane, a truck idled. Jack. He leaned against the door, one hand holding a thermos, the other shoved deep into his coat pocket. "Didn't mean to bother," he said when she approached. "Just thought you might want some coffee that didn't taste like barn dust." Clara managed a small smile. "Depends who brewed it." He shrugged. "Can't be worse than yours." For a moment they both laughed, soft, awkward, but real. Jack looked past her toward the pond. "Heard you been out to the barn." She hesitated. "I found something." He nodded like he already knew. "Your father was a good man, Clara. Did what he thought would keep you smiling." He shouldn't have. Maybe not, but we don't get to choose the kind of love we're given, only what we do with it after. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. She turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes fill. "I'll be out your way tomorrow," he said. "Then some of my north lines come down again. You might see smoke from my burn pile." "Good," she said too quietly. When he drove off, the world folded back into its silence. Clara stood in the yard until the sound of his engine was gone, the letters still warm in her pocket. That evening, she sat by the stove again. She reread her father's words until her eyes blurred, and then reached for her own notebook, the one with the soft cover and half-filled pages. She wrote slowly, carefully, each word deliberate. "You were right, Daddy. The pond held longer than any of us did, but I'm learning it doesn't have to break to change. When she finished, she placed the note beside his letters, folded them all into the toolbox, and slid it under the bed. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the eaves. The pond groaned once, deep and low, like the sound of something remembering. Chapter 15. The Fence Line. The next morning broke clean and sharp. The sky was the color of tin, the kind of cold that made everything ring. Clara woke before the stove went cold, before the frost had even begun to fade from the windows. She filled a thermos, packed 2 sandwiches, and slipped on her boots. The letters stayed in the house, tucked inside the toolbox beneath her bed, but she felt their weight all the same. From the porch, she could see the smoke Jack had mentioned. It rose in a thin gray line beyond the trees, steady and unhurried. She followed the sound of his hammer before she saw him. He was at the far edge of his property, near the old fence line that separated their land, a row of cedar posts leaning like tired soldiers. "Morning," she called. Jack looked up from the post he was tamping, his breath clouding in the air. "Didn't think I'd see you out here before noon." "Couldn't sleep." He smiled faintly. "Still water'll do that." She stepped over the wire and knelt beside him, taking hold of a length of fencing. "Where'd you want it?" "Right there's fine." They worked without much talk. The sound of the hammer, the hiss of breath, the cold creak of wire. The rhythm of it settled between them like something remembered. After a while, Jack straightened, resting his arm on the top rail. "You opened that box?" Clara hesitated. "Yeah." "And?" She looked down the fence line, frost glittering on the grass, the pond beyond catching the pale light. He loved harder than the world allowed him to. Jack nodded. He was a good man, just born to a hard season. For a while neither spoke, then Clara said, "You never stopped writing, did you?" He shook his head. "Didn't figure you needed me to stop." "I didn't," she said softly. "I just didn't know what to say back." The wind rose, rattling the wire. Somewhere nearby, a crow called once, sharp and lonely. Jack took off his gloves, rubbing his hands together. "You staying?" I don't know yet. You will," he said, quiet as a promise. By mid-afternoon, the fence was mended. They sat on the tailgate of his truck, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. The sky had turned to pewter, the kind of color that meant snow wasn't far off. "Town will start talking soon," he said, half smiling. "You back here working my fence, you know how they are." Clara laughed under her breath. "Let 'em." He watched her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Found this cleaning out the glove box. Guess it belongs to you." It was one of his old letters, creased, weather-worn, but still legible. "You don't have to answer, Clara. Just know the pond's still here. I am too." She held it without speaking, and when she finally looked up, Jack was already walking toward his truck. He paused at the door, tipping his hat the way he used to. "Don't let the pipes freeze," he said. And then he was gone, leaving only the faint smell of coffee and cedar in the cold air. That night, Clara lit a lamp and laid the letter beside her father's. Different handwriting, same steadiness. 2 men who'd loved her in the only ways they knew, by building things that could weather time. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and slow. The pond disappeared under a thin white skin, and the world, for a little while, was silent enough to hold everything. Chapter 16. The Pond's Memory. By March, the air began to change. The snow no longer shone. It dulled, thinned, grew soft underfoot. Water whispered beneath it, testing the edges of the earth again. Clara stood on the porch one morning, breath fogging the glass of her coffee mug, and watched a single drop fall from the eave. It hit the railing and rolled down the wood like a bead of glass, the first melt. She hadn't realized until that moment how quiet winter had been. The creaks, the cracks, the stillness, they'd become her company. Now the faint sound of dripping made her uneasy, as though the land were remembering something it shouldn't. At the post office, the talk had turned. You can hear it groan some nights, one of the farmers said. The Benton Pond, same as the year it happened. Always does that time of year, another replied, half whispering. Means it's trying to let go. Clara kept her eyes on the notice board, pretending to read about cattle vaccines and a lost dog. But the words seeped through her anyway. Trying to let go. When she stepped back outside, the world felt louder than before. The snow along the ditches had started to collapse in on itself, leaving dark streaks of soil exposed. The thaw had begun. That evening, Jack stopped by. His truck tires hissed on the wet gravel as he pulled into the drive. He climbed the steps carrying a small bag of feed and the smell of rain-soaked denim. Ground's turning soft, he said. You'll want to keep the gate latch tight. Already froze open, Clara said, half smiling. Seems nothing around here stays the way it should. He chuckled low, setting the bag down by the door. That's Stillwater for you, always shifting, even when it looks still. For a while they talked about small things, the cattle in the Harris pasture, the flooded ditch near the old highway. But the silence that came after wasn't uncomfortable. It had shape to it. Jack's gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the window, where the pond glowed faintly in the last of the evening's light. He used to come by our place, your dad, he said quietly, week before it happened. Clara turned to face him. I didn't know that. He was looking for a tow chain. Said he'd been checking the ice. Jack's jaw tightened. My dad told him it wasn't ready yet, but your father just smiled that way he did. He said, the ice will hold if the Lord wills it. Then he left. The words struck like cold water. Clara gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the room tilt. You never told me. I was 14. Didn't seem my place. And after, well, nobody wanted to talk about it. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the yard, carrying the faint sound of cracking ice. Both of them turned toward it. The noise came again, a deep, echoing groan from the pond, like something old shifting in its sleep. Jack met her eyes. You hear it too? She nodded. Every year. Later, after he'd gone, Clara walked down to the pond. The air was heavy with the scent of thaw. Wet earth, sap, the ghost of last year's grass. The ice had begun to split near the edges, thin lines reaching outward like veins. She crouched by the water, tracing the cracks with her eyes. The pond reflected her face, fractured and trembling. Beneath the surface, she thought she saw movement. Not a shadow exactly, but memory taking shape. The sound of her father's laughter, the hum of the tractor engine, the smell of diesel in the cold air. For the first time in years, she whispered aloud to the silence, I'm still here. The water didn't answer, but the ice gave one soft sigh, a release, or maybe a reply. She stayed there until the stars began to rise, their light mirrored in dark water. Then she turned back toward the farmhouse, her breath steady, her steps slow. Behind her, the pond was quiet again. But she knew now that silence didn't mean peace. It meant remembering. Chapter 17. The Hidden Letter. The thaw came fast that week. By morning, the air had softened. The snow along the field sank inward like tired lungs. The gutters ran with water, and the yard smelled of mud and memory. Clara woke to the sound of dripping. Steady, rhythmic, insistent, and for a moment she thought it was rain. But when she opened the curtains, she saw the sky was clear and pale, streaked with the faint blush of dawn. The pond shone in the distance, thin mist curling above it like breath. The ice had broken clean through the center overnight, leaving a dark vein of open water. She went to the barn after breakfast, the way she always did when the quiet felt too large. The floorboards were damp, the air rich with the scent of oil and thawed hay. The toolbox sat under the workbench where she'd left it, red paint dulled to brown, the latch still stiff with rust. She opened it carefully, the hinge groaning in protest. Inside, the papers she'd read before were stacked neatly, edges curling from moisture. Beneath them lay one she hadn't noticed. It was wedged flat under the false bottom of the box, the corner just barely visible. When she pried it loose, a small nail clinked against the wood. The paper came free, brittle, stained, but intact. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to my Clara May, just one word scrawled across the top. Ruth. Clara's breath caught. She hesitated, thumb tracing the faded ink. Then she unfolded it. Ruth, if the ice gives, I'll be close. Don't let her think it was for pride. It was for the light in her face when she laughed last summer. I thought maybe I could bring that back. If I don't, tell her it wasn't the ice that failed. It was my measure of it. Tell her the world's meant to hold her longer than it held me. The handwriting faltered near the end, the ink thinned by cold or by hands that already knew. Clara pressed the page to her chest, her heart beating so hard it seemed to echo through the barn. She closed her eyes and saw it. Her father standing on the ice that day, not proud or reckless, but trying to build something soft in a hard world. When she opened her eyes again, tears blurred the corners and the light streaming through the slats turned the air gold. Jack found her there an hour later. She was sitting on the barn floor, her back against the wall, the letter spread in her lap. He crouched beside her without speaking, his shadow falling across the paper. What is it? He asked quietly. She looked up at him, her voice rough. He wasn't trying to prove anything, Jack. He was trying to give me a reason to smile again. Jack nodded slowly. Sounds like him. She handed him the letter. He read it once, carefully, as though the words might disappear if he moved too fast. When he finished, he folded it back along its old creases and placed it in her hands. Some men don't get remembered right, he said, but maybe you can fix that. Clara swallowed hard. Maybe that's what the letters were for. Jack smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time to write one of your own. That evening, as the sun went down, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a blank page before her. The window was open, the sound of running water carrying through from the pond. She dipped her pen and began to write, not to anyone living, but to the quiet itself. The ice did hold Daddy. Not that day, maybe, but the years after. It held me when I thought I'd break. It held this place. It even held Jack. The ink spread slightly where a tear landed, softening the words. She left the letter on the table, waited by a mug, and stepped outside. The air was warmer now, the kind of warmth that feels borrowed from somewhere far south. At the edge of the pond, the last shards of ice floated lazily, spinning in circles. She bent down, touched the surface with her fingertips, and whispered, "It held." Chapter 18. Ruth's Prayer. The next morning dawned bright and bare. The frost was gone from the windows, and the air in the house had changed, lighter somehow, as if something had shifted in the night and left room for breath. Clara made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her father's letters still lying beside her own. The ink had dried into the paper like roots. Outside, birds called from the cottonwoods, tentative and bright. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a home again. She spent the afternoon cleaning the upstairs room, dust rising in soft plumes from every surface. In the bottom drawer of her mother's old dresser, beneath a folded quilt and a bundle of handkerchiefs, She found a hymnal wrapped in linen. The cover was cracked, the pages thin as breath. Tucked between Psalms and Lamentations was a scrap of paper, yellowed and creased from being held too often. On it, Ruth had written in her careful script, "Be still and know." Psalm 46:10. A pressed wildflower was pinned just below it, brittle now, but still faintly pink. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, turning the hymnal in her hands. The house was so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the old clock downstairs. Her mother had always hummed when she worked. Not loud, never full songs, just fragments. Standing at the sink, hanging laundry, stirring stew. Those sounds had filled the spaces between their words. Now sitting there, Clara began to hum too. At first the tune stumbled, but then it found itself, soft and sure, rising from some place older than memory. That evening, Jack came by with a bundle of fence wire and a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. When he stepped into the kitchen, the smell of cedar and flour followed him. "Thought you might have forgotten to eat again," he said, setting the bread on the table. Clara smiled. "I'm trying to get better at remembering." He glanced at the letters still sitting near the lamp. "You keeping those out for a reason?" She nodded. "To remind me what not to forget." Jack leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets. "Your mama used to sing when she walked past our place. My mom always said she knew Ruth Benton was hanging laundry by the sound of it." Clara looked down at the hymnal, opened that marked page. "I think she left this for me." Jack smiled, quiet and knowing. "She did." After he left, Clara carried the hymnal to the porch. The night was warm, the kind that carried the scent of soil and thaw. She sat in the rocking chair, opened the book, and whispered the verse aloud. "Be still and know." The words caught on the air and lingered, the kind that didn't need to be answered. Out by the pond, frogs had begun to call, the first real sign of spring. She leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the sounds fill the space around her. Later, before going in, she left the hymnal on the porch railing. The pages fluttered, once in the breeze, then settled open to that same verse. For a moment, it looked like someone had been there before her, turning to the same place. Clara smiled, small and certain. Inside, the clock began to tick again. Chapter 19, The Thaw Beneath. By late April, the land had come alive again. Snowmelt carved narrow rivers through the fields, and the ditch grass rose in soft, trembling blades. The pond, finally free of its armor, shone wide and dark, reflecting a sky that seemed to go on forever. Clara woke each morning to birdsong, not the single tentative calls of early spring, but full, layered choruses. The sound filled the house like light. She'd left the windows open now, even when the air still carried a bite. On the table sat her mother's hymnal and her father's letters, side by side. She'd stopped rereading them every day, not out of neglect, but because she no longer needed proof that they'd loved her. The knowing lived in her now, quiet and complete. Jack arrived one morning with a wagon load of cedar posts. "Fence won't fix itself," he said, hopping down with a grin. Clara laughed. "You sure about that? Stillwater's done stranger things." He tossed her a pair of gloves. "You talking to the land again?" "Maybe it's talking to me." "Then you'd better listen close." They worked along the north field for hours, hammering posts and stretching wire, the smell of thawed earth thick and rich around them. The air shimmered with heat and the faint hum of insects. At one point, Clara stopped to watch a red-winged blackbird land on the fence line, its wings flashing bright as fire. Jack looked up from the post he was tamping. "Never seen one that close before?" he teased. "Not like this," she said. "Feels like the world's been holding its breath all these years." "Maybe it was waiting on you." The words hung there, simple and sure. Clara didn't answer, but her smile was enough. By noon, they'd reached the end of the fence. Jack leaned against a post, wiping sweat from his brow. "You know," he said, "my dad used to say a good fence isn't meant to keep things out. It's meant to keep what matters in." Clara nodded, looking out over the field, the pond glimmering beyond, framed by cottonwoods and the house sitting quiet and steady against the horizon. "Then we've done it right," she said. That evening after Jack left, she walked down to the pond. The air was warm now, the grass damp under her boots. Frogs croaked from the reeds, and ripples moved across the surface where minnows darted. For the first time since she could remember, she didn't feel the pull of what was lost. She felt only the peace of what remained. The water mirrored the sky, golden at the edges and deepening to blue. When she knelt at the bank, she could see her reflection clear, not fractured anymore, just one unbroken face looking back. She whispered the words that had carried her this far. It held. And this time when she said it, she meant herself. Chapter 20. The Promise Kept. Time began to move differently that spring. Not in great leaps, not in sudden years, but in seasons. Rain, harvest, snow, thaw, each one folding softly into the next until time itself seemed to hum with the sound of work being done and love being lived. Clara stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because every road she'd ever taken led back here. Back to the fields that whispered her name in the wind. Back to the pond that had learned how to forgive. That summer she and Jack married beneath the cottonwoods. No preacher, no crowd, just the two of them, a few friends from town and the smell of rain waiting in the air. Clara wore a cream dress that Ruth had sewn years ago and kept folded in a cedar chest. Jack had pressed his best shirt and still managed to wrinkle it by the time they said their vows. They exchanged rings by the pond, the same pond that had once taken, now bearing witness as it gave something back. Afterward, they danced on the porch while the gramophone played faint and warbling through the open window. Fireflies blinked above the fields, and the world felt new again. Years passed the way years do when they're full, quietly, steadily, without needing to prove their worth. They rebuilt the barn, mended the roof, and planted a garden where Ruth's old clothesline once stood. Clara taught art at the small school in town, filling the walls with drawings of rivers and skies and hands at work. Jack farmed through drought and flood, swearing at the weather but never at the land. There were nights when the two of them sat on the porch long after dark saying nothing, watching lightning flicker along the horizon. Other nights, laughter came easy, full, rolling, the kind that doesn't need an audience. Sometimes Clara would take out the hymnal and read by lamplight. Sometimes she would hum, and Jack would hum along, off-key, but sincere. The house filled again, not with ghosts, but with living things, with warmth, with the scent of bread and paint and cedar. Every spring when the thaw came, Clara would walk down to the pond and lay a single lantern on the water. It floated quietly toward the center, its lights off but sure. Jack would stand beside her, arm around her shoulders. "Still holding," he'd say. And she'd smile, "Still holding." When Ruth's birthday came around, they planted a new willow near the water's edge. When Elias's letters grew too fragile to read, Clara copied them by hand, the ink steady this time. Each year the roots grew deeper. Each year the land remembered their steps a little less sharply and welcomed their presence a little more kindly. Still water no longer felt haunted. It felt kept, the way a promise is kept. By the time the 90s came, the world beyond the farm had changed. New machines, new music, new ways of living. But here, the rhythm stayed the same. And on nights when the wind was just right, carrying the scent of hay and water, Clara could still hear the pond's faint sigh, not of grief now, but of gratitude. She'd stand at the porch, the same view before her that her father once saw, and think, the ice did break, but the love didn't. Chapter 21. A Good Day. The thaw came slow that year. Snow lingered in the hollows, and the ditches ran high, spilling into the lane like narrow, restless creeks. The fields, once hard as iron, loosened by inches each day, the earth remembering its softness. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of damp wool and ash. Clara opened the kitchen window and let in the sound of dripping eaves. Steady, rhythmic, the land breathing again. The kettle hissed on the stove, its whistle low and tired. She poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Jack, and carried them to the table where sunlight cut a bright square across the wood. The mug she chose had a faint crack running down its side. It had belonged to Ruth. Clara traced it with her thumb, a line that hadn't broken, just held its shape, the kind of flaw that lasted. Jack's boots thudded down the stairs. "Smells like rain comin'," he said, tugging his suspenders into place. "Smells like thaw," Clara answered. "That's not the same thing." He grinned. "You'd know. You've got the nose for it." She handed him his cup, and the steam fogged the glass behind him. Outside, the world was silver with meltwater. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away. The sun was high, bright enough to turn the snow to slush. Jack was out with a shovel, clearing the drainage trench that had overflowed overnight. Clara watched from the porch, one hand resting on the post where Elias used to hang his hat. "You'll flood the whole yard before you fix it," she called. He straightened, wiped his brow with his sleeve, and pointed the shovel like an accusation. "You could come help, you know." "I am helping," she said, "and keeping an eye on you." "From a safe distance?" "It's the only way you'll get anything done." Jack laughed, a full, open sound that carried across the yard. He bent again to his work, the shovel biting into wet earth, water glinting where the sun caught it. Clara stepped off the porch, her boots sinking into mud. She crossed to the fence line where the runoff pooled in shallow mirrors. Kneeling, she dipped her hand into the cold water and felt the shock of it travel up her arm. The world was waking beneath her touch, worms stirring, roots drinking deep, the promise of something green. When she looked back, Jack had paused to watch her. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat everything stilled. The air, the water, even the sound of the shovel sliding from his grip. He walked over, mud splattering his boots. "You'll catch your death." "I've already had my share of that," she said, smiling. He didn't argue. He just took her wet hand in his and squeezed once before letting go. That afternoon, clouds rolled in from the west. A light rain followed, soft and patient. They ate supper by lamplight, stew and bread still warm from the oven, while the radio hummed a weather report. The announcer's voice cracked through the static. Temperatures rising, fields expected to clear by week's end. Jack leaned back in his chair. "About time. I'm tired of waiting to the barn." Clara smiled over her bowl. "You say that every year." "And I mean it every year." Outside, the rain turned steady, drumming against the roof in slow, sure rhythm. She imagined it running down the window panes, over the porch steps, finding its way to the pond. The sound filled the spaces where words didn't need to go. After dinner, Jack lit the fire and stretched out on the couch, boots off, eyes half closed. Clara sat in her chair by the window with a blanket across her knees and her sketchbook balanced on her lap. She drew the view, the lines of the yard softened by water, the faint glow of the barn light through the mist. The pencil moved easily now. She no longer drew to remember pain, but to hold peace. That night, the rain eased and the world quieted under the weight of dripping branches. In bed, Jack slept with his hand resting on her arm, the steady rhythm of his breathing a lullaby of its own. Clara lay awake, watching the ceiling glow faintly with the moonlight through the curtains. She thought of the pond, of how every spring it swallowed and gave back the world in equal measure. She drifted into sleep with that thought, and in her dream, the ice did not crack. It melted, slow and sure, and beneath it she saw her reflection, older, softer, unafraid. When she woke before dawn, the window pane was clear for the first time in months. The air smelled of earth instead of frost. Jack murmured her name in his sleep. Clara turned toward the light spreading across the floorboards and whispered through the morning, "Then let it melt." Chapter 22. The House of Summer. By June, the fields had turned green and loud. Grasshoppers rattled in the ditch grass. The air smelled of clover and heat, and the windmill clicked slow and lazy against the wide blue sky. The Bentons' house stood open to the season, every window raised, every curtain breathing in and out. On the porch rail, Clara's wet laundry flapped like a row of white flags surrendering to the wind. Inside, sunlight pooled across the floorboards, catching the specks of dust that drifted through the air. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the sharper tang of linseed oil from the easel in the corner. Stillwater had never looked more alive. The fields shimmered under the noon light, and even the pond, once a mirror for grief, gleamed like a coin tossed back by the sky. Jack was out in the north pasture when she brought him lunch, bread and cheese wrapped in a towel, a jar of lemonade sweating through the cloth. "Thought you might need rescuing," she called, stepping around a patch of thistle. He wiped his brow with the back of his arm, the sun bright on his neck. "You come bearing peace offerings, then?" "Truce, at least," she said. "You've been fighting that fence line all morning." Jack glanced at the twisted post and grinned. "It's stubborn." "So are you." "Runs in the family," he said, and reached for the towel. "Sit a spell." She did, settling into the grass beside him. The earth was warm and smelled faintly of rain from the night before. They ate without hurry, their conversation small and soft, the kind that came only after years of silence. That evening they sat on the porch steps with lemonade and the last of the light. Fireflies blinked above the tall grass, and the frogs had begun their slow chorus from the pond. Clara leaned her head against Jack's shoulder. "You remember when we used to think summers lasted forever?" He smiled. "They did once. Feels shorter now. That's just time catching up. Maybe we should slow down and let it pass us again." Jack looked out toward the pond where the willow tree cast long shadows across the water. "Might be worth trying," he said, "though I don't reckon the weather listens to anyone." She laughed softly. "Stillwater might." They rose early the next morning to beat the heat. The garden was heavy with beans, and the air already hummed with bees. Clara worked in her wide-brimmed hat, hands deep in the soil. She had always found comfort in that. The quiet, the rhythm, the feel of roots pressing back against her palms. Jack came by with the hoe, pausing to rest a hand on her back. "You'll outwork me yet." "Doubt it," she said, straightening, "but I'll try." He nodded toward the pond. "Water's dropped some. Guess the earth's thirsty too." "Let it drink," she said. "It's earned it." At night she painted. The canvas leaned against the wall, half finished, the pond in the late light, the sky bruised purple, the willow reflected in the shallows. Jack watched her from his chair, boots crossed, a book resting unread in his lap. "You ever going to sign one of those?" he asked. "Maybe," she said, "when I stop painting for myself. I like that you do." She smiled without looking up. "Then maybe I'll never stop." He chuckled and went back to his book, the lamplight pooling between them, golden, steady, ordinary, the kind of light that made you forget the dark even existed. By August, the air shimmered with heat. Grass along the fence line turned gold, and the pond drew down to half its size. The world slowed to a hum. On Sunday afternoons, they'd sit on the porch after church, shoes off, her head on his shoulder, the radio playing softly from the kitchen. Sometimes they talked about the week, crops, weather, the neighbor's new baby. Sometimes they said nothing at all. It was enough just to be there, two people who had survived the worst and learned how to live gently afterward. One evening, a storm rolled over the horizon, black clouds stacked high and humming with thunder. Jack stood at the window and watched the trees bend. You think it'll pass us? Clara asked. He shook his head. Storms like that don't pass anyone. She smiled, resting her hand over his. Then we'll ride it out. And they did. Together. The thunder rolling over the roof, the rain lashing against the windows, the pond swelling again in the darkness. By morning, the air was washed clean, the sky bright as tin. Jack opened the door, and the smell of wet earth filled the house. He looked back at her and grinned, still holding. Clara met his eyes, always. Chapter 23, The Letters of Faith. Autumn came soft that year, warm enough that the garden kept growing along past its welcome. The tomatoes refused to quit, the beans tangled themselves into knots, and the willow by the pond had doubled in size since spring. Clara spent most mornings in the kitchen, humming without meaning to, her hands always busy, shelling peas, scrubbing jars, hanging linens in the sharp, clean light. There was a new patience in her work, a slower rhythm she hadn't known she could keep. Sometimes Jack teased her about it. You used to fly through a morning, he said one day, leaning against the door frame. Now you move like you've got all the time in the world. Maybe I do, she said. He smiled at that, soft and certain, the way he smiled when he understood more than he said. One afternoon, while sorting through the trunk that had been Ruth's, Clara found the letter. It was folded between the pages of an old hymnal, the ink faded to the color of dried tea. The envelope had never been sealed. Across the top, in Ruth's careful handwriting, "To my daughter, when she is ready." Clara stared at it for a long while before sliding it open. The paper crackled like it had been waiting to speak. The letter wasn't long, just a single page, but the words reached straight through the years. My dearest girl, if you are reading this, I trust you've come to understand that love and sorrow are not enemies. They are threads of the same cloth, and both are holy when carried with gentleness. I pray you will never let grief harden you the way it tried to harden me. There is goodness in you, Clara, not the kind that needs to be seen, but the kind that stays when no one is looking. When you feel lost, go to the pond. It will remind you that even still water moves beneath the surface. Your mother, Ruth. Clara's throat tightened. She read it again, slower this time, until the words began to steady her breathing. She sat at the table, the letter beside her coffee cup, and watched the light shift across the floorboards. Outside, the pond glimmered through the trees. When Jack came in, boots muddy and shoulders dusted with hay, he stopped short at the sight of her face. What's happened? She shook her head, smiling through it. Nothing. Everything. He came closer, eyes falling on the letter. Is that from her? Clara nodded. It was waiting for me. Jack pulled out the chair across from her and sat. And? She forgave me, she said, long before I ever learned how to forgive myself. That night, Clara dreamed of her mother's voice. Not the stern one from her sickbed, not the silence that followed Eliza's death, but the voice from before all that, the one that hummed hymns while folding sheets, that laughed too easily, that believed the world was full of small mercies. When she woke, it was still there, faint but steady, like a heartbeat. Weeks passed and the air grew colder, the nights lengthened, and the geese began their calls over the pond. The house smelled of cedar and stew, and Jack's laughter seemed to fill every corner. One morning, Clara stood by the window, hands braced on the sill, watching frost creep up the glass. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the thin, cold barrier between her skin and the season outside. Jack came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. You've been quiet these days, he said. Just tired. He nodded, but didn't let go. You've been baking enough for a whole congregation. You sure it's just that? Clara smiled. Maybe I'm nesting. He turned her gently toward him, searching her face. Oh, Clara. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took his hand and placed it against her stomach, light, deliberate. It took him a heartbeat to understand. When he did, his breath caught. "You mean—" She nodded. Jack laughed, that warm, disbelieving kind of laugh that comes when the world suddenly feels too big to hold. He wrapped her up in his arms, kissed her hair, and whispered against her ear, "Well, would you look at that?" She leaned into him, her smile soft. "Looks like Stillwater's keeping its promise." That evening, Clara sat by the lamplight and read Ruth's letter once more. The words didn't feel like memory anymore. They felt like instruction. When she reached the line about the pond, she set the letter down and looked out through the window. The water beyond the cottonwoods shone faintly under the rising moon. It was still. It was waiting. And for the first time, Clara understood what her mother meant. Stillwater moves, quietly, faithfully, even when no one sees. Chapter 24, The Floodplain. By late February, the ditches were already running high. Ice broke in soft murmurs along the pond's edge, and the willow's roots drank deep, their tips reaching into the thaw. The fields shone under a thin film of meltwater, each furrow a mirror catching the low sun. Jack said it was too early for runoff. Clara said the earth knew its own timing. They didn't argue about it, not really. It was the kind of easy back and forth that filled their days now, small talk stitched through a larger quiet. Clara had begun to show, just slightly, a roundness that pressed soft against her apron, a new patience in how she moved. The women in town noticed first, as women always do. "Bless you both," Mrs. Hawthorne said, when Clara stopped by the post office. "Your mamma would have been beside herself with joy." Clara smiled, and tucked the package under her arm. "I think she's still managing that one way or another." Jack waited for her outside, hat pulled low against the cold wind. "You told her?" "I didn't have to," she said. "Hawthorne knows everything before it happens. Probably told me before I knew." He laughed. "So it's official now. The whole town will have it before supper." "Let them," she said. "It's good news for once." Back home, the wind had softened, carrying the smell of wet earth and old grass. Jack headed to the barn, muttering about feed and mud, while Clara lingered by the pond. It was higher than it should have been, not dangerously so, but enough to worry him. The willow's lower branches brushed the water, their buds like small promises. Clara bent and picked up a stone, tossing it lightly. The ripples moved outward in perfect circles, widening until they touched the far reeds. When she stood, her back ached slightly. She rested a hand on her belly and smiled to herself. "You'll know this place," she murmured. "You'll know every sound it makes." The first real flood came a week later. Not the kind that ruins, but the kind that reminds. Rain rolled in from the south, warm and relentless. The snow vanished overnight, and the creeks broke their banks. Jack spent 2 straight days hauling sandbags to the low edge of the field. Clara brought him coffee and scolded him for wading too deep. "It's not the ocean," she said, standing on the porch. "It's close enough when you're in it," he called back. She shook her head, smiling, and went inside. The sound of rain on the roof filled the kitchen, loud, rhythmic, alive. It reminded her of her father's boots, the way he'd paced when a storm moved in. But Jack's voice outside cut through that old memory, steady and present. He wasn't afraid of the water. He respected it. When the rain finally broke, the air turned cool and blue. The pond stretched wider than she'd ever seen it, nearly touching the fence posts. Jack stood at the edge, hands on his hips, and let out a long breath. "Never seen it this high," he said. "It'll fall again," Clara replied. He glanced back at her, and his eyes softened. "You sure?" She smiled. "It always does." That night they sat by the fire. The house smelled of damp wool and smoke, and the baby kicked for the first time. A flutter, then stillness. Clara froze. Jack noticed the look on her face and set his book aside. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it over her belly. The movement came again, stronger this time, a small, insistent heartbeat beneath the surface. Jack's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be." Feels like the earth itself, she whispered. He laughed under his breath, overwhelmed and reverent all at once. Stillwater's got another voice now. They stayed like that a long time, the firelight flickering across their faces, the sound of the pond moving in the distance. In the weeks that followed, the water began to sink back into the soil. Grass rose in its place, bright and new. Jack rebuilt the fence line where the current had tugged it loose, driving each post with a kind of stubborn joy. Clara painted again, smaller pieces this time. The pond, the willow, the muddy banks. Each canvas shimmered with motion, the edges soft, the light alive. When she finished one, she signed it at last. Not her full name, just her initials, C.M.B. Jack found her at the table that evening, hands still smudged with paint. "What's this, then?" he asked, picking up the drying canvas. "Something worth keeping," she said. He smiled. "Looks that way to me." Later, as the sun went down, they stood together by the porch rail. The pond reflected the last of the light. Calm now. The water line steady once more. Jack slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Think we'll ever get used to this place?" Clara leaned into him, eyes on the horizon. "No," she said softly. "I hope we never do." Chapter 25. The New Fence. By early May, the land had dried, though the fields still bore the scars of the flood. The soil had shifted in places, dark and rich and heavy. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, the wires sagging low between them. Jack called it honest working waiting to be done, and Clara said it sounded like a sermon. He'd start early, before the sun burned the mist away, hauling new cedar posts from the shed. The air smelled sharp and clean, full of sawdust and spring. Clara brought him water and watched from the porch, one head resting absently on her belly. He'd look up sometimes, catching her watching him, and grin. "You're supposed to be resting." "I am," she said, "just doing it while standing." Jack laughed, shaking his head. "Never met a woman so allergic to sitting still." "Then you married the wrong one," she teased. "I don't think so." By noon, the fence line began to take shape again. Straight rows of cedar against the pale field, solid and clean, the kind of work a man could measure his worth by. Each post sunk deep, each wired pulled tight. The sound of his hammer echoed against the hills like a heartbeat. Clara brought sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper, and sat nearby on the overturned milk crate while he ate. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He glanced up. "Leaving Stillwater?" She nodded. "Sometimes I wonder what it'd be like. A house in town, maybe? Somewhere without mud this deep and fences that always break." Jack chewed slowly, eyes drifting toward the pond. "I've been other places," he said. "They're quieter, maybe, easier, but none of them ever felt like home. Even after everything that happened here?" "Because of everything that happened here," he said simply. "This land remembers us, Clara. It remembers what we've lost. But it also remembers we stayed." She smiled faintly. "Sounds like something my mother would have said." "Well, she was right about most things, wasn't she?" "Eventually," Clara said, and they both laughed softly. Later that evening, Clara stood by the fence while Jack finished the last few posts. The baby kicked again, stronger now, and she pressed her hand against the movement, marveling at how life could make its presence known in such small, certain ways. Jack noticed her stillness and set down his hammer. "You all right?" She nodded. "Just feeling the world move." He came over, wiping his hands on his jeans, and crouched slightly to rest his palm against her side. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of lilac and damp grass. "She's strong," he said. Clara arched a brow. "She?" Jack smiled. "I can tell." "Maybe it's a boy." He shrugged. "Then he's stubborn. Either way, takes after you." That night, they sat on the porch steps as the sky went lavender. The new fence stretched behind them, clean and unbroken. Fireflies had begun their soft blinking across the pasture. Jack rested his arm along the railing, the wood still smelling of fresh-cut cedar. "You think this one will hold through winter?" "It will," she said. He chuckled. "You sound awfully sure. I've learned that things built with care tend to last longer than the ones built in a hurry." Jack turned his head, watching her face in the fading light. "That from a letter or a sermon?" "Neither," Clara said. "Just the truth." When the first stars appeared, they walked down to the pond together. The water line had settled, the surface smooth again. The willow reflected perfectly, roots deep, branches wide. Jack skimmed a stone and missed. Clara picked one up and sent it skipping 7 times before it disappeared into the dark. "Show off," he muttered. "Elias taught me," she said, smiling. He grinned back. "Guess I've got big boots to fill." "You already have," she whispered. Back at the porch, Jack took her hand, rough and warm against hers. "I was thinking," he said, "we should build another fence. One around the garden, maybe. Keep the rabbits out this year." Clara smiled. "You just like excuses to swing that hammer." "Maybe," he said, "but I like building things that last." She looked out toward the field, where the new post caught the last glint of light. "Then we're in the right place," she said softly. "This land remembers how to hold." Chapter 26. The Long Summer. By June, Stillwater had gone gold. The fields shimmered under the sun, the air thick with the hum of bees and the faint creak of the windmill turning in slow rhythm. Days stretched long and heavy, stitched together by the steady sounds of life being lived. The thud of Jack's boots across the porch, the chirp of swallows under the eaves, the whisper of fabric as Clara hung sheets that ballooned like sails in the wind. The pond had settled into its summer calm, smooth and deep. The willow's branches touched the surface now, heavy with leaves. When the wind passed through them, it sounded like breath, slow and full. Clara moved slower, too. Her belly had grown round and certain, her steps measured, her dresses let out and mended again. She laughed easier these days, though she tired faster. Sometimes she'd rest her hands over the curve of her stomach and whisper softly, as if the child could already hear the world outside. Jack tried not to hover, but he did anyway. He fixed every squeaky hinge, tightened every step, and checked the roof twice in 1 week. One afternoon, when she caught him oiling the porch rail, she leaned against the door frame smiling. "You know, this house was standing fine before you came along." Jack straightened, rag in hand. "Wasn't married then. Standards are higher now." She said. "You plan on protecting me from the weather or yourself from boredom?" "Both," he said without hesitation, grinning. She rolled her eyes, laughing, but there was warmth in it, the kind that only comes when love has learned the shape of ordinary life. July brought storms. Thunder rolled low across the prairie, slow and deliberate. Rain beat the tin roof in sudden bursts, leaving the air heavy and sweet. Clara would sit by the window during them, a blanket over her lap, counting the seconds between flash and sound. Sometimes Jack joined her, mug in hand, boots off, the two of them watching the sky's temper together. "Reminds me of when I was a boy," he said once, his voice soft. "Used to sit with my ma by the window, just like this. She'd tell me the thunder was angels rolling barrels across heaven." Clara smiled faintly. "My mother said it was the Lord moving his furniture." Jack chuckled. "Guess heaven's a noisy place, then." They sat in silence after that, watching the rain run down the glass. When it ended, the world outside looked washed and new, the fields gleaming, the air still dripping with light. By late July, Clara began to nest. It wasn't something she decided, it simply happened. She washed every curtain, polished every jar, rearranged drawers no one ever opened. Jack came in one evening to find her on her knees scrubbing the baseboards. "Clara May," he said, settling down his hat. "You're due in a month. You shouldn't even be bending." "I'm not bending," she said. "I'm nesting." He leaned in the doorway, smiling despite himself. "You're making me nervous." "Good," she said. "Now you know how I feel every time you climb that roof." He held up his hands in surrender. "Fair." The next morning dawned soft and misty. The pond lay like a mirror under the gray sky, and the fields whispered with life. Clara walked down the path slowly, barefoot, the grass cool beneath her feet. She stopped by the willow, resting one hand against its trunk. A few drops of rain clung to the leaves, catching the light. She thought of her mother, how Ruth had come here once at dawn, barefoot too, and touched this same tree. The memory was faint but sure, something that seemed to live in the soil more than her mind. "Still holding," she whispered. A small kick answered her. She smiled. "You hear that? That's your family motto now." In the evenings, they sat on the porch, the sun a slow ember sinking beyond the fields. Jack would shell peas or mend a harness while Clara read aloud from her mother's Bible. Not the verses about fear or wrath, but the ones that spoke of endurance. "The earth remains," she read one night, voice quiet but steady. "Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease." Jack looked up from his work. "Sounds like a promise." "It is," she said, closing the book, "and I'm holding him to it." By early August, the heat became relentless. Even the air seemed to hum with anticipation. Jack worked early and late. During the middle of the day, they both rested, the world too still, too bright for anything else. One afternoon, as cicadas screamed in the trees, Clara woke from her nap and found the house empty. Jack was down by the fence, shirt off, hammering something into place. She stood at the window watching him, the strength in his movements, the rhythm of the work, the light on his skin. For a fleeting second she saw Elias instead, the same shoulders, the same quiet focus. The thought didn't ache this time. It soothed. Jack looked up and waved, and she waved back, smiling. The child moved again, a steady thrum beneath her ribs. "Don't worry," she murmured. "That one's yours." That night, a breeze came in through the open window. The curtains lifted and fell like slow breath. The moon hung low, and the pond shimmered silver in its light. Clara lay awake, listening to Jack's steady breathing beside her, one hand resting on her belly. The child shifted again, restless but sure. She thought of the long winter behind her, the years of silence, the ache of grief, and of how somehow she had found her way here, to this room, this man, this steady hum of life returning. The world was full again, and this time it felt like it might stay that way. Chapter 27. The Night of the Storm. The storm rolled in just before dusk. At first it was only a soft wind through the cottonwoods, a low hum like the earth warning of its own turning. But by nightfall, thunder had begun to murmur over the horizon, and the smell of rain drifted in through the open window. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to her belly. The baby had been restless all afternoon, kicking in short, sharp bursts like it was trying to tell her something. Jack was downstairs, checking the windows, the barn, the generator, the same dance he always did when the weather came heavy. When the first flash of lightning lit the room, Clara exhaled slowly and whispered, "Not tonight." But the ache came again, low and certain. Jack returned just as the rain began, water glistening in his hair. "Looks like it's going to be a rough one," he said, unbuttoning his coat. "Fence will have to wait till morning." She nodded, breath caught halfway in her throat. He noticed the look on her face immediately. "What is it?" "Jack," she winced, hand clutching the blanket. I think it's time." His eyes widened, and for half a second he stood frozen. Then the storm outside cracked with thunder and the house seemed to tremble with it. He was moving before the echo faded, grabbing towels, boiling water, fumbling with the phone on the wall. "Doctor's in town," he muttered. "Roads will be flooded before he gets here." "Then it's just us," Clara said, voice steady despite the pain. Jack dropped the receiver, crossed to her side, and knelt beside the bed. "Then it's just us," he echoed. The wind howled through the eaves. Rain lashed the windows in sheets. Each thunderclap felt like the sky itself splitting open. Clara gripped his hand through every contraction, breast sharp, body trembling with effort. Between the waves of pain, she whispered small prayers, not for deliverance, but for strength. Outside, the pond surged against its banks. Water ran down the lane, silver in the flashes of lightning. The earth that had once swallowed her father's voice now thundered with her own. Jack kept his voice low and calm. "You've got this, Clara May. You're stronger than the storm." She met his eyes through the sweat and the tears. "You sound like your mother." He laughed breathlessly. She'd like that. Hours blurred. The clock downstairs struck midnight, though neither of them noticed. The storm reached its height, a roaring chorus of wind, thunder, and the rhythmic rush of rain against the roof. Then, through it all, came a new sound. Soft at first, a small, thin cry that cut clean through the storm. Clara sagged back against the pillows, tears streaming freely now, her face radiant with exhaustion and wonder. Jack, shaking, held the tiny bundle close, his voice breaking on a laugh. "A boy," he whispered. "You've got yourself a son." Clara reached out her arms. "Let me see him." Jack laid the baby gently against her chest. His skin was warm and damp, his cry already fading into small, steady breaths. "Eli," Clara murmured. "We'll call him Eli." Jack smiled. "After your father?" "After the men who keep their promises." The rain began to ease. Outside, the pond was swollen and alive, the willow's leaves glittering with water. A single flash of lightning illuminated it, silver, unbroken, whole. Inside, the baby's breathing fell into rhythm with the storm's retreat. Clara stroked his tiny hand, marveling at the strength in something so small. Jack knelt beside them, head resting against her arm. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He's still water," Clara said softly. "All of it. The quiet, the storm, the start again." The thunder rolled one last time across the hills, low and distant now, like a heartbeat fading into peace. When dawn came, the world was washed clean. The fields shone under a soft layer of mist, and the pond reflected a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Jack stepped onto the porch, the baby bundled in his arms. The air smelled of wet cedar and milkweed. He looked out over the field, the fences, the house, the life they had made, and whispered, still holding. Behind him, Clara's voice floated through the doorway. "Always." Chapter 28, The Harvest Dance. By September, the land had dried and glowed gold again. The wheat stood tall, heavy-headed, rippling under the steady wind. The air had changed, cooler now, edged with the smell of apples and wood smoke. Jack said it was the best harvest they'd had in years. Clara said it was about time Stillwater stopped testing them. The town agreed. So when the last of the grain was brought in, the barn swept clean, someone, likely Mrs. Hawthorne, declared there would be a dance. "We're due for some joy," she said at church, hands on her hips. "The good Lord's been patient with us long enough." And so, on the first Saturday of October, the old Miller barn filled with music, light, and laughter for the first time in over a decade. Clara stood near the entrance, Eli asleep against her chest, the soft hum of his breathing steady under the fiddle's rise and fall. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting honey-colored light over the rough-hewn beams. The floor creaked with the shuffle of boots and the swish of dresses. Jack was talking with a few men from town, shoulders loose, face open, laughing in a way she hadn't seen since before the flood. When he caught her watching, he grinned and crossed the floor to her. "He asleep?" he asked, nodding toward Eli. "Finally," she whispered. "He likes music until he doesn't." Jack looked down at the small bundle, his eyes soft. "He's got your timing." Clara smiled. "He's got your stubbornness. Good balance, then." He took her free hand and spun her gently toward the open space near the center of the room. "Jack, just one turn," he said. "He'll sleep through it." She hesitated, then let him lead her. They moved slow, careful not to wake the baby, her skirt brushing against his boots, the music swelling and falling around them. For a moment, it was just the two of them again. The hum of the fiddle, the warm light, the familiar scent of hay and sweat and cider. When the song ended, applause rose, and Clara laughed, the sound pure and unguarded. Mrs. Hawthorne clapped her hands from across the room. About time the Bentons took a turn. Jack bowed exaggeratedly, making a few of the men laugh. "Couldn't let the rest of you show us up." Clara rolled her eyes but couldn't stop smiling. She returned to the edge of the room where the long tables were lined with food. Pies, bread, roast chicken, pickles, jars of wild plum jam. The abundance of it nearly endeared her. She thought of the years that had followed her father's death, the hush that had fallen over this same town, the way people had once avoided looking her mother in the eye. And now here they were, laughter echoing off the rafters, her child safe in her arms, the air thick with forgiveness that no one had needed to name. Outside, the night was cool and clear. The moon hung low, and the fields shimmered pale under its light. The sound of music drifted through the open barn doors, mingling with the smell of dust and clover. Jack came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. "Too loud for you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just needed air." He looked out across the fields with her. "Never thought we'd see it like this again." "Me neither," she said. "But I think the land's been waiting for us to forgive it." He smiled at that. "You think dirt holds grudges?" "I think everything that holds life holds memory," she said softly. "And memory's not the same as bitterness." He kissed her temple, silent. Back inside, the band struck up an old hymn reworked for dancing. Mrs. Hawthorne started it, clapping in time, and soon the whole room followed. Boots stomped, hands joined, voices lifted. Kara joined in, swaying gently with Eli in her arms, his small face turned toward her heart. She hummed the melody her mother used to hum while baking, and for a moment, she swore she could feel Ruth's presence in the warmth of the air, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. Jack caught her eye from across the room, smiling, that quiet, unspoken smile that said everything. We made it through. And for the first time in years, Clara believed it. When the night ended and the lanterns burned low, they walked home under a sky scattered with stars. The pond shimmered faintly as they passed, the willow's reflection rippling in the breeze. Jack paused by the fence and looked out over the water. "You think he'll remember nights like this?" Clara adjusted the sleeping baby in her arms. "Maybe not, but he'll feel them, the way we feel what we can't name." Jack nodded slowly. "Then that's enough." They stood there for a long time, the wind soft against their faces, the world whole and quiet again. And somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of the fiddle carried through the fields, not mourning this time, but gratitude. Chapter 29. The Winter Child. By December, Stillwater had fallen silent again. The kind of silence that came after good work and full harvest, not sorrow. Snow dusted the fields in soft layers, smoothing out the furrows and fence lines until the world looked whole again. The pond was frozen, thinly at first, then solid and glassy by Christmas. The willow bowed low under its weight, its branches glittering in the pale light. Clara stood at the kitchen window most mornings, Eli balanced on her hip, watching Jack out by the barn. He moved slow these days, careful on the ice, his breath a steady fog in the cold air. Eli reached toward the glass, his small hand leaving smudges that caught the sunlight. "That's your father," Clara whispered. "He thinks he's still 20. Eli cooed and pressed his palm against hers. The house had changed since his birth, not in the way it looked, but in the way it sounded. There were soft creaks in the night, tiny sighs and laughter that came from deep in her chest. The air felt different, alive with the rhythm of ordinary miracles. On the shelf above the stove sat a row of canning jars, a few of them still half full from summer. Between them was Ruth's old Bible and the letter Clara had found months earlier, the edges now worn from rereading. That morning, while Eli napped, Clara opened it again, tracing her mother's handwriting with her finger. "When you feel lost, go to the pond. It will remind you that even still water moves beneath the surface." She folded it carefully, then reached for her own notebook, the one she'd been filling slowly all season. Small reflections, sketches, prayers. She began to write. "Dear Mama, the pond is frozen again, but it doesn't frighten me anymore. I've learned that stillness isn't the same as silence. It's where life gathers before it begins again. You were right. Love and sorrow are threads of the same cloth. But I found there's joy woven through, too. The kind that lasts even when the world goes quiet. Your grandson smiles when he hears the wind. I think he recognizes it. All my love, Clara." When she finished, she closed the notebook and pressed her palm against its cover, not as farewell, but as keeping. That afternoon, Jack came in stomping snow from his boots, cheeks pink from the cold. "Fence is holding," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Of course it is," she replied, smiling. "It was built with care." He kissed her temple and looked down at Eli, who was gumming a wooden spoon on the floor. "He's going to want one of his own soon." "Not yet," Clara said. "Let him learn how to walk first." Jack chuckled and crouched to scoop the boy up, tossing him gently in the air. Eli squealed, the sound bright and sudden against the hush of the room. The laugh stayed in Clara's chest long after it faded. That night, the three of them sat by the fire. The room glowed amber, shadows dancing along the walls. Eli slept in his cradle beside the hearth, one tiny hand curled around the blanket edge. Jack leaned back in his chair, reading aloud from a tattered book of prairie stories. His voice was low and slow, the kind of sound that filled the spaces between words. When he finished, Clara said softly, "He's going to have your voice." Jack smiled. "Yours too. You'll be the one telling him the stories that matter." She glanced toward the window, where frost feathered the glass. Maybe someday he'll tell his own. Later, after Jack had gone to bed, Clara sat alone for a while, the house quiet but not empty. She listened to the creak of the roof, the faint whistle of wind through the stovepipe, Eli's even breathing. The kind of silence that used to hurt now comforted her. She rested a hand against her middle, not because she was in pain, but because something felt new there, a flutter, faint but familiar. Her breath caught. She smiled, slow and sure. "Stillwater," she whispered. "You never stop moving, do you?" The wind outside shifted, brushing snow from the roof, and somewhere deep in the house, between memory and promise, the sound of life began again. Chapter 30. The Road to Spring. By the time the snow finally began to melt, the Benton farm had grown noisier, not with machines or engines, but with life itself, the laughter of a child, the lowing of cattle, the whistle of the windmill spinning again after a long freeze. Eli was walking now, running, really, chasing the dog through puddles that reflected the early sun. Every step he took seemed to startle the land awake. His boots splashed through the meltwater, his hands outstretched, his voice echoing through the bare trees. Clara stood at the porch railing with baby Owen in her arms, the soft weight of him anchoring her to the moment. The air smelled of thawing earth and wet cedar. Every drip from the eaves felt like time itself loosening its grip. Jack came up from the field, shovel slung across his shoulder, boots heavy with mud. His grin was wide and boyish. "He's got your energy," he said, nodding toward Eli. Clara laughed. "Then heaven help us when there are two of them." Jack wiped his brow and leaned in to kiss Owen's head. "You just keep making more reasons for me to build fences." The days stretched longer again. The garden, still half frozen, promised green beneath its crust of frost. Jack spent his afternoons repairing the plow, and Clara worked at the kitchen table, sketching the view from the window. Not the pond itself this time, but the road that led toward it. There was something about that road, the way it curved past the willow, how the tracks never seemed to vanish no matter how deep the snow. It reminded her of how the past never really leaves. It just changes shape. In her sketchbook, she wrote in the corner, "The road to spring is never straight." On Sundays, the family rode into town in the old truck Jack had rebuilt. The roads were soft with mud, the sky wide and silver. At church, Mrs. Hawthorne fussed over the boys like they were her own. "They've got Benton eyes," she said, tapping Eli's nose, "and Harris' stubbornness. That's a dangerous combination." Clara smiled. "Tell me about it." After service, the townsfolk gathered outside with coffee and chatter. Talk of crops, fences, babies, and weather. The small threads that held them all together. It struck Clara then how much had changed since that first long winter. The people who once whispered her family's name with pity now said it with pride. Stillwater had forgiven itself. That evening, Clara walked down to the pond. The ice was almost gone, just thin shards clinging to the edges. She crouched near the water's edge. Owen bundled against her chest and let Eli toss pebbles into the shallows. Each one landed with a small splash, the ripples spreading wide. "Why does the water move?" he asked. "Because it's alive," Clara said. He squinted skeptical. "Water can't be alive." She smiled. "It is if you listen long enough." Jack joined them a few minutes later, crouching beside her. "He's full of questions today." "He takes after his father." Jack grinned. "Good. Keeps the world honest." They watched the water together, quiet except for the birds overhead and Eli's laughter echoing through the fields. That night, after the boys were asleep, Clara sat by the window with her sketchbook. The moon was bright enough to draw by. She turned to a fresh page and began to sketch the pond again, smaller now, gentler. The willow bowed low, roots deep in soil that had known both sorrow and grace. In the corner, she drew the faint outline of the farmhouse and the narrow road leading toward the horizon. When she finished, she signed it the same way she always did, CMB, and added one new word beneath, home. By morning, the meltwater had carved small streams through the fields. The road glistened in the early light. Jack hitched the plow to the tractor while Eli ran ahead, shouting about birds returning. Clara stood on the porch, the baby in her arms, her heart full and steady. The world felt young again, not because the years had vanished, but because they had mattered. Jack looked back at her from the field, hand raised. "Still holding," he called. She smiled and called back, her voice carrying across the thaw. "Still holding." And the land answered in its own way, in the drip of meltwater, the rustle of branches, the slow, certain rhythm of life returning. The road to spring, after all, was never straight, but it always led home. Epilogue. The place where water remembers. The pond was smaller now. Not by much, just enough that the willow's roots reached a little farther each year. The water was clear and quiet, rippling only when the wind crossed it. Grace Benton stood at the edge, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. She had her mother's eyes, that same gray-blue color that caught both sky and sorrow, and her father's way of standing still, like the ground was part of her. Behind her, the farmhouse stood exactly as it always had. The paint was newer, the windows replaced, but the shape of it, the way it leaned into the light, remained. Inside, the voices of her brothers carried through the open door. Eli's laugh, Owen's teasing, June calling someone to supper. The sounds of a life built on the quiet labor of those who came before. Grace smiled faintly and looked back toward the pond. A single lantern floated near the center, small, steady, its reflection trembling with the breeze. She knelt and touched the water. It was cool, smooth against her palm. "They said you were cursed once," she whispered, "that you took more than you gave." The lantern's flame flickered, bright and sure. I don't believe that," she said softly. "You were just waiting to be forgiven." Behind her, the door creaked. Eli, tall now, his hair streaked with the same sunburnt gold as their father's, leaned against the frame smiling. "You talking to the pond again?" Grace shrugged. "Someone has to listen." He laughed. "You sound like Ma." "Good," she said, standing. "Someone should." Eli came closer, his eyes on the lantern drifting toward the far reeds. "Still holding," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "Always." As the sun sank behind the fields, the water turned to glass, gold fading into rose, rose fading into blue. The willow bent low, its leaves brushing the reflection like a benediction. Grace stood a moment longer, letting the air settle around her. She thought of all of the hands that had built this life. The fences, the harvest, the laughter, the prayers whispered into the soil. Then she turned toward the house, the lantern's light still steady behind her, and walked home. Inside, the table was full. The walls were lined with Clara's paintings, rivers, skies, and faces of those long gone. In the center of the table sat a worn notebook, its pages soft with age. Ruth's old handwriting faint but still legible. Grace brushed her fingers across it before sitting down. "All right," she said softly. "Let's eat." Outside, the wind moved through the fields, gentle and constant. The pond caught the last of the light and kept it, still, faithful, and remembering. The end. Some winters never end. They just wait for you to come home. From Stillwater by Osprey Dixon. Coming soon, Stillwater Rising, a novel of legacy and renewal. 2 decades after the thaw, the Benton children inherit a world changed by time and by rising waters. As floodlines creep back across the prairie, Eli fights to save the farm that built him, while Grace discovers the truth buried beneath its soil. Love, loss, and the ache of returning. The Stillwater story continues. This story was inspired by a short piece I wrote many years ago, in elementary school, believe it or not, and by the quiet strength of families who endure long winters, both literal and emotional. While this novel is a work of fiction, its heart is rooted in real places, real losses, and the belief that healing often comes slowly, like the thaw. Thank you for listening. For those who keep tending what others would abandon, who mend fences, plant hope, and believe in thaw, this story is yours.